There are cases that not only inspire fear, but also expose the brutal truth of how a society can destroy the lives of innocent people. Today's story, the Rocío Wanninkhof case, is one such tragedy. A 19-year-old girl disappears near her home. A blood-stained road. Strange clues lead to a chilling mystery. The entire country of Spain was in a panic. In their desperation to find the murderer, the crowd criticized an innocent person. The media portrays her as the villain. Society condemns her in an instant. And the legal system imprisons her, not for her crime, but for the fear and prejudice of the people. But the truth, more horrifying, darker, and more unbelievable, is only revealed when another girl also disappears. Amidst the tears, trials, and baseless accusations, a single question remains: who really killed Rocío? And how could the authorities have arrested the wrong person, while the real killer remains at large, continuing his hunt? Alicia Hornos was born on December 2, 1952, in the rural province of Jaén, within the municipality of Aulló del Junco, Spain. At the age of 24, she fell in love with and married a Dutch citizen named Willem Guillermo Wanninkhof. Soon after their wedding, they had their first child, a son named Guo, followed by two daughters, Rosa and Rocío. As their family grew, their marital relationship began to deteriorate. Willem developed a drinking problem, became frequently absent, and eventually lost his job. He would often shout at Alicia during arguments and occasionally became physically violent. To support her family, Alicia worked at a hotel in Ibiza. There, she met Maria Dolores Loli Vasquez, the hotel director and daughter of Galician immigrants who had settled in the UK. Maria was well-educated, polite, and a good conversationalist. A strong friendship between the two women quickly developed into a romantic relationship. A year into her relationship with Maria, Alicia found the courage to leave Willem and finalize their divorce. Willem returned to the Netherlands, while Alicia moved in with Maria. They quickly bought a new house in Malaga and raised their 3 children together. After their parents divorced in 1983, Rocío and Rosa considered Maria their second mother and proudly bore the Vasquez surname. All 3 of Alicia's children loved Maria deeply. The 5 of them lived together in harmony, creating what felt like a true family. In 1988, Alicia and Maria decided to end their romantic relationship, but continued living as close friends until 1994. Alicia then started a new relationship with Juan Cirillo, moved to a new house, and became happier. However, this seemingly perfect life took a dark turn. On the morning of October 10, 1999, Alicia realized her daughter Rocío was missing. Initially, she assumed Rocío had spent the night at a friend's house or with her boyfriend. As time passed without Rocío's return, Alicia's worry intensified. The family reached out to Rocío's friends and boyfriend, but received no news. On September 9, Rocío had left home around 5:30 p.m. after saying goodbye to her mother and sister, Rosa. She planned to go to the fair with her boyfriend, Antonio José Jurado, and a few other friends. The fair was held near La Cala de Mijas, the neighborhood close to Antonio's house. Rocío stayed at Antonio's house until about 10:30 p.m., then decided to go home to shower and change before meeting Antonio and her friends at the fair. However, she never made it back home. Although Alicia, Rocío's mother, felt anxious, she chose to take a walk with Juan to calm her mind instead of immediately reporting her daughter's disappearance to the police. While walking, they discovered a large pool of blood in the middle of the road. Approaching closer, Alicia recognized a pair of blood-stained sneakers and confirmed they were Rocío's. Frightened, she asked one to call the police. Besides the shoes, they also found a napkin and some bloodstains in the area near the road. Rocío usually walked. Alicia immediately reported the situation to the police, providing a detailed description of her daughter's long hair, brown eyes, wearing a white Nike t-shirt and purple pants. Immediately after the official search began, forensic investigators realized the need for a thorough examination of the crime scene. Their primary objective was to identify the source of the blood found on the road and on the sneakers. Initially, they suspected it was an assault or fight, resulting in injuries. However, further investigation revealed a larger amount of blood, with long, drag marks, suggesting a potentially much more serious situation. At one point, the blood trail disappeared, but shortly after, the search team discovered a large pool of blood, indicative of significant blood loss. They also found bloody footprints and marks resembling those made by a body being dragged. These traces ultimately led to tire marks, after which the blood evidence stopped abruptly. Near the tire tracks, investigators found a cigarette butt from a brand that was rare in Spain. Forensic teams collected as many samples as possible that could aid the investigation, with DNA evidence expected to help identify who had been at the scene. From this evidence, investigators conducted thorough analysis, including identifying the type of blood found along the blood trail. While the search for Rocío continued, authorities became increasingly convinced that she had been murdered. The trail of blood started on the sidewalk and formed a large pool, indicating she had lost a significant amount of blood, potentially leading to death. Next to the pool of blood were clear drag marks, and diagonally across the pool were the tire tracks of a small car with tires that had been out of production since 1993. The drag marks led across a steep area, making it highly unlikely that one person could have moved a body alone. Investigators concluded that at least 2 people were involved in dragging the body before it was left in a remote area, and a vehicle had arrived to transport it. Despite the dire situation, the search continued. Volunteers scoured the area on foot, by motorcycle, and over nearby hills. Everyone hoped to find Rocío alive, but there was a growing fear of discovering her body. The situation was heartbreaking for all involved. Flyers with Rocío's photograph were distributed widely, and all major news outlets reported on her disappearance. The family collaborated closely with journalists, believing that as long as Rocío remained in the public eye, she would not be forgotten. However, as time went on, the search yielded no results. A few days after Rocío disappeared, a local taxi driver approached the police. He reported that on the night of the incident, around 10:00 p.m., he narrowly avoided a speeding SUV in the opposite lane, near where the girl's sneakers had been found. He also recalled hearing a chilling scream as he passed the vehicle. At that point, it became increasingly clear that Rocío had been abducted and killed by an unknown assailant. This conclusion was later confirmed through DNA analysis, which revealed that the blood found on the road belonged to Rocío. The family was left in shock by this revelation, and the news quickly spread, affecting the entire nation. On November 2, 1999, 25 days after Rocío disappeared, a severely decomposed body, believed to be hers, was found near the Los Altos del Rodeo Sports Club between Marbella and San Pedro Alcantara. The body was concealed by underbrush and fallen leaves, lying hidden behind a fence separating a residential area near the highway. This location could only be accessed via a narrow trail, difficult to traverse by vehicle. The initial search had focused on areas near her home, yet she was ultimately found in a different town. When police arrived at the scene, they found the body in an advanced state of decomposition. While collecting evidence, officers discovered large black garbage bags containing the girl's clothing. One of the bags had the number 8 painted on it, indicating that the bags were reused rather than purchased specifically for transporting the body. After examining the clothing, investigators found that the items might belong to Rocío, who had gone missing. Her sister, Rosa, recognized several rings, 2 t-shirts, and other personal belongings found in 2 garbage bags near the body as belonging to Rocío. The t-shirts were torn, indicating a violent struggle, and clothing from the waist down was missing. The remains were sent to a laboratory for forensic analysis. 6 forensic experts worked meticulously through the night, using their skills to examine the remains, which were in an advanced state of decomposition due to heat, rain, and humidity. This environment had destroyed any internal organs, leaving only skeletal remains. Their goal was to find any evidence that could clarify the circumstances of the attack. Despite the challenging conditions, the experts discovered multiple sharp force injuries, including 8 stab wounds on the back made by a single-edged weapon. Their findings suggested the attack was quick and extremely violent, indicating that the victim might have been restrained or unable to defend herself. Additionally, fingerprints were found on the plastic bags at the crime scene. The police already had fingerprints and tire tracks from a vehicle related to the case, along with 2 tissue samples from Rocío's body. However, this evidence was not enough to identify or apprehend a specific suspect. Although the investigation had gathered some clues, none led to a breakthrough. Public pressure was mounting, creating an urgent need for answers. However, no verified evidence has been presented yet. Because Rocío's body had decomposed, investigators were unable to determine crucial details, such as whether she had been abused. Upon examining the position of the body, they noted that her legs were spread apart, which they interpreted as a staged scene. As a result, they ruled out abuse as a motive and shifted their focus toward a crime driven by revenge and hatred. Investigators theorized that the attack was emotionally charged, implying the perpetrator might have been someone close to Rocío who harbored strong feelings of anger or resentment. Based on the evidence collected, police began follow-up interviews, starting with her boyfriend, Antonio. He was the last person known to have seen Rocío alive and had plans to meet her again that evening. However, Antonio provided an alibi, claiming he fell asleep at home and did not attend the fair that night. Rocío's relatives and friends were also questioned, but each had a solid alibi. Nearly a year after Rocío's death, the civil guard narrowed down potential suspects. By year's end, they identified one individual considered a viable suspect, Maria Vázquez. Although there was no concrete evidence against her, the media fueled public suspicion of her guilt. Maria was a close friend of Alicia, Rocío's mother, and sensationalized reporting suggested that Alicia had accused Maria from day one. In reality, Alicia and Maria had stopped being friends 4 years before the crime occurred. Despite the lack of evidence, the investigation began to align more with public sentiment than the facts. The focus shifted entirely to Maria, who was alleged to have a motive. It was claimed that Rocío may have been a source of conflict between Alicia and Maria. Some speculated that if Rocío had not existed, Alicia might have reconciled with Maria, suggesting that Maria's actions were a form of revenge for Alicia's refusal to return. After Maria's arrest, the press and public presumed her guilt, even though she never confessed to anything. Local residents were convinced of her involvement, largely because investigators believed the killer must be someone connected to the family. Relatives described Maria as aggressive, violent, and very jealous. Alicia informed journalists that Maria was vindictive and cruel, which heightened public anger against her. Maria was heavily criticized, and her unconventional lifestyle became a target of attack throughout the trial, especially since it was still considered unusual in Spain. The media gradually portrayed her as sarcastic, hostile, calculating, and cold-hearted, a narrative that influenced public opinion long before a verdict was reached. She was seen as a wicked woman who had spent 4 years nurturing her hatred before committing the crime. Journalists bombarded the media with headlines about a close family friend being charged with the murder of Rocío. Maria was not well liked, making it unlikely for her to receive a fair trial. She lacked warmth and approachability. But does that make someone a criminal? The struggle took place not just in the courtroom, but also in the public sphere, where opinions significantly influenced the case. The ongoing flow of information, particularly rumors spread by the media, shaped the jury's views. Almost every television channel and talk show claimed Maria had killed Rocío. As reporters distorted the facts, repeated lies began to be accepted as truth. In reality, there was no solid evidence against Maria. However, justice seemed intent on convicting someone, and she became the obvious target due to her weak alibi and personality traits that made her an easy scapegoat. Maria was never present at the crime scene. The tire tracks found did not match her vehicle. The fabric fibers recovered were not from her clothing, and the fingerprints on the trash bags did not belong to her. She maintained that she spent that day caring for her sick mother and her young niece, but this alibi was largely disregarded. During the trial, over 50 witnesses testified, but Maria only spoke on the stand once. She stated that she did not kill Rocío and had not even seen her that day. She urged the jury and all of Spain to find the real perpetrator, insisting that it was not her. Maria claimed that the true criminal was still out there, possibly among those in the courtroom. She also added that there had never been any evidence against her, and there never would be, because she was innocent. She contended that Spain's judicial system is deeply flawed, often violating legal boundaries. According to her, prosecutors and judges disregarded the law to support their theories, showing little concern for justice. There was no physical evidence linking her to the crime. Instead, the authorities' report relied primarily on circumstantial evidence and psychological profiles, identifying her as the suspect. Under public pressure, the jury found Maria Dolores Loli Vasquez guilty of murder and sentenced her to 16 years in prison. The public celebrated the verdict. Rocío's funeral drew large crowds, while reporters continued to film, showing little compassion for the family's grief. Rocío's family and the townspeople lived in fear, further fueling numerous television programs that scrutinized every detail of the case. After Maria's arrest, Rocío's family appeared on numerous television programs to recount their stories, contributing to the portrayal of Maria as cold and ruthless. It took years and another similar crime for it to be clear that the narrative imagined by the public and promoted by the media was profoundly flawed. On the morning of August 15, 2003, the parents of 17-year-old Sonia Carabantes reported her missing. They asked her friends, who said they had driven her to her doorstep, but she never made it inside. Just 3 houses away, her parents discovered her shoes, purse, and phone next to a tree. Bloodstains were also found on nearby parked cars. This scene raises alarming questions, especially since Maria has been in prison for almost a year and a half. Did this mean the police had made a serious error, leaving an innocent person incarcerated? As a result, authorities immediately started a search and launched an investigation into this troubling incident. As time passed, Sonia's family grew increasingly desperate. Neighborhood searches were conducted, but the bloodstains found on Sonia's belongings gave little hope for a positive outcome. One critical piece of evidence was a broken car headlight. Officers searched all the repair shops in the area, looking for vehicles with similar damage. Several theories about the attack were put forward, including the possibility of mass abuse or a connection to Rocío's earlier disappearance. A striking detail was that both girls had gone missing during local fairs, similar to the investigation into Rocío's case. Authorities questioned all employees working at the fair. Flyers displaying Sonia's photograph were distributed widely, and many community members volunteered to assist with the search. The community rallied behind the police, offering time and resources to help find Sonia. Meanwhile, the civil guard kept pursuing the investigation with the main objective of finding her alive. Unfortunately, on the 5th day after Sonia went missing, a sniffer dog led authorities to her body, which had been found in a stream under a pile of rocks. The heavy rain the night before washed away many traces that could have aided the investigation. On the day of her disappearance, Sonia had attended a fair, saying goodbye to friends near her home, where she was attacked. The assailant struck Sonia multiple times, leaving her partly unconscious and unable to defend herself. She was then forced into a car and taken far away from her neighborhood. During the attack, Sonia suffered both internal and external injuries and ultimately died from strangulation. Since her body was discovered relatively soon after her death, investigators could recover vital evidence. Colonel Bella later announced that they had found significant forensic evidence on Sonia's body. Biological samples were tested and entered into the National DNA Database, where investigators eventually discovered a crucial match with DNA from cigarette smoke found at Rocío's crime scene. Comparing the two DNA samples shows that they are completely identical. The man who killed Rocío in 1999 was the same person responsible for Sonia's murder. This shocking discovery confirmed that Maria, condemned by society, was ultimately innocent, while the real killer remained at large, taking Sonia's life. The investigation's pieces finally fell into place. Both the cigarette butt in Rocío's case and the skin fragments under Sonia's fingernails matched the same DNA. From that point on, events unfolded rapidly. On September 18th, a young woman named Cecilia Matilda Pantoja reported her ex-husband to the police after noticing bloodstains on his shirt a few days after Sonia's body was found. She revealed that he had been absent from home and had made 2 unexplained car trips on the day of Rocío's attack. Through DNA testing, combined with Cecilia's testimony, the police finally identified the real killer in both cases. The culprit was Tony Alexander King, a man with a prior criminal record in the UK known as the Holloway Strangler. Tony's criminal activities began in his teenage years in the Holloway area of North London. In 1985, the community was shaken by a series of attacks on women, where the victims were strangled and abused. At that time, Tony was known by his birth name, Anthony Bromwich. Within 5 weeks, at just 19 years old, he was arrested and convicted of strangling 5 women into unconsciousness with a rope or cable before assaulting them. A judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison, calling him a monster. He served only 5 years and was released on conditional early in 1991. However, shortly after, he was arrested again for robbing a woman and threatening her with a knife. Attempting to start anew, he changed his name to Tony Alexander King, married Cecilia, and tried to create a normal family life. They had a daughter, but Tony soon reverted to his violent lifestyle. Spanish police began to suspect him in connection with certain crimes. After they placed him under 24-hour surveillance, Tony was arrested 1 month after Sonia's death. He confessed to murdering 2 young girls, detailing how he stalked Rocío as she walked home from her boyfriend's house and threatened her with a razor. When she attempted to escape, the razor cut her neck, and in a panic, he stabbed her 9 times. In 2005, Tony was sentenced to 36 years in prison for kidnapping, assault, and the murder of Sonia Carabantes. The court also ordered him to pay approximately $350,000 in compensation to Sonia's family. Additionally, he received a 7-year sentence for an attempted assault on a woman in Malaga in 2001. The following year, he was convicted of murdering Rocío Wanninkhof, resulting in another 19-year prison sentence. Tony later wrote letters to the mothers of Sonia and Rocío, asking for their forgiveness. He is currently incarcerated at the Herrera de la Mancha maximum security prison in Ciudad Real, Spain. After the case was closed, a significant scandal erupted in Spain when it was revealed that an innocent person had been wrongfully convicted for Rocío's murder. Often, when miscarriages of justice occur, they bring disappointment to those involved and financial repercussions for the state. However, in Spain, this isn't always the case. It can be hard to accept that even in the 21st century, the police and courts can wrongly penalize innocent individuals, while society can also unjustly condemn them. Even after proving their innocence, formal apologies are rare. Maria Dolores Loli Vasquez, the innocent individual wrongfully convicted, spent over a year trying to assert her innocence. Many misinterpreted her calm demeanor as coldness, unaware that it reflected her personality. In 2008, the Spanish Ministry of Justice offered Maria €120,000 in compensation, far less than the €4 million she had initially sought. Yet she never received an apology for the treatment she faced. After being released, Maria returned to the United Kingdom. More than 20 years have passed since then, but Maria has still not received a formal apology or any additional compensation since her case was closed in 2014. She later worked for a transport company in East London and received psychological support following her traumatic experience. Recently, she stated that she is still awaiting an apology after years of anxiety, explaining that the fear and humiliation she suffered hindered her ability to communicate and find stable employment for a long time. Maria's imprisonment is viewed as one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in Spain's judicial history since 1910. Criminals can often escape accountability with startling ease, even leaving behind DNA evidence before fleeing the country. In their rush to resolve cases, police frequently blame the first available suspect rather than seeking the complete truth. The media worsens matters by sensationalizing stories and invading the privacy of both suspects and victims, often prioritizing drama over accuracy. Society also plays a part, hastily branding individuals as guilty and justifying their imprisonment simply based on personal biases. Sadly, this grim reality is not exclusive to Spain. It reflects a global issue that affects many countries to varying extents. June 22, 1980 was a Sunday. Early that morning, 25 years old, Stephanie Malin returned home at around 4 a.m. after finishing her shift as a waitress at a restaurant. Before going home, she stopped by a colleague's house, so by the time she got back, she was very exhausted. Everyone in the house was asleep. As she walked through the first floor, Stephanie noticed her 14-year-old cousin, Suzanne Bombardier, wasn't there. Suzanne usually waited on the living room sofa to greet her, but she assumed the girl must be elsewhere in the house. Despite calling Suzanne's name several times, she got no response. While the situation seemed odd, Stephanie wasn't alarmed. It was too early to search the house thoroughly, and she didn't want to wake her daughters, aged 5 and 6, who were sleeping in their room the night before. June 21st, Stephanie had asked Suzanne to babysit her girls. Suzanne loved spending time with the children and was excited to help. Known for being a responsible and kind teenager with excellent grades and big dreams for the future, Suzanne had eagerly accepted the task. Stephanie assumed Suzanne had fallen asleep in the children's room after putting them to bed. Feeling tired herself, Stephanie also went to bed without checking further. A few hours later, she woke up and began preparing breakfast for the kids. While she was in the kitchen, the phone rang. It was Suzanne's mother asking when her daughter would be coming home. Wanting to ask Suzanne directly, Stephanie went to the children's room, but found that the little girl wasn't there. Her daughters said Suzanne hadn't been in their room when they woke up and didn't know where she was. Growing concerned, Stephanie searched the entire house, from the first floor to the second, but Suzanne was nowhere to be found. It became clear that Suzanne hadn't spent the night at the house. Stephanie was alarmed. Stephanie called her own mother to inform her of Suzanne's disappearance. Both were confused, as Suzanne had always been a responsible teen. She never ran away, had no boyfriend, and certainly wouldn't leave young children alone in the house. Stephanie carefully searched for any clues about Suzanne's whereabouts, but found nothing. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, she and her mother contacted the police. Law enforcement officers arrived and began investigating. They asked when Suzanne was last seen. Stephanie recounted that on the evening of June 21st, she was preparing for her restaurant shift and asked Suzanne to watch the kids. After work, Stephanie planned to stop by a co-worker's birthday party. At around 8 p.m., Stephanie called home and asked Suzanne to bring her some clean clothes to work. Suzanne agreed and brought them. That was the last time Stephanie saw Suzanne. After delivering the clothes, Suzanne headed back home. Stephanie watched her cross the street and waved goodbye. This account was corroborated by Stephanie's daughters and her co-workers. The children confirmed that Suzanne returned home, gave them dinner, and helped tidy up their toys. They also remembered what Suzanne was wearing: a nightgown and a red robe. Suzanne wasn't dressed to go out, which suggested she wasn't planning to leave the house. After putting the children to bed, Suzanne intended to watch TV or read a pastime she enjoyed. She was supposed to spend the night at Stephanie's house and head home the next morning after breakfast. At around 1:30 a.m., while at her co-worker's birthday party, Stephanie called home again to check in. Suzanne answered promptly and reassured her that everything was fine. The children were safely asleep, and Suzanne, feeling tired, was getting ready for bed. This phone call was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Suzanne. Using eyewitness accounts, investigators pieced together a rough timeline of the incident. Suzanne disappeared within a 2-hour window between 1:30 a.m., when Stephanie last called home, and 4 a.m., when Stephanie returned home and realized Suzanne was missing. The police initially suggested she might have run away, but her mother and sister rejected this possibility. Suzanne was calm, mild-mannered, and had no history of conflict with her family or aggressive behavior. Her teenage years were uneventful, and there was no reason to believe she would have left voluntarily. Moreover, her belongings, including her bag, clothes, and shoes, were left behind. It was highly unlikely that she would have run away wearing just a robe and slippers. The possibility of a kidnapping was considered. Detectives theorized that burglars might have broken in and encountered Suzanne, either as an unintended witness or because she attempted to intervene. However, this seemed improbable. no valuables or belongings were missing from the home, according to Stephanie, and there were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Given the lack of disturbance, detectives speculated that Suzanne may have voluntarily allowed someone she knew into the house or left with them willingly. The lack of any evidence of a struggle or violence in the home. Everything was undisturbed, added to the mystery. The children sleeping in adjacent rooms heard nothing unusual. Investigators also questioned nearby neighbors in the townhouse complex. Families in neighboring units, who might have overheard something through the walls, reported nothing suspicious. Suzanne's disappearance shocked the quiet neighborhood and became the focal point of concern throughout the district. From the start, the case appeared inexplicable, and detectives struggled to find solid leads. Authorities combed the area around the house and thoroughly searched the premises, but found no new evidence. Neighbors and Suzanne's school community were interviewed, but no one had valuable information. Residents hadn't seen any unusual people or vehicles in the area. That Sunday evening had been an ordinary night, and given the time period, CCTV cameras were not yet common. The lack of surveillance made it harder for detectives to progress, and the investigation hit a dead end. Desperate for leads, police appealed to the public for any information. They received tips from several witnesses, but none panned out. 5 days after Suzanne's disappearance, there were still no breakthroughs or new evidence. Detectives began to suspect the worst, that Suzanne may have been killed, though her family refused to accept this possibility and clung to hope that she would be found alive. In the meantime, Suzanne's family worked tirelessly to spread awareness of her disappearance. They plastered the streets with flyers and distributed them widely. Investigators examined the family's immediate environment, but found no one who posed a potential threat to Suzanne. Her social circle didn't include any troublemaking teens. Detectives also started reviewing the profiles of local criminals with histories of abuse or violent offenses, but each had a verified alibi. The case took a tragic turn on June 27th, about 100 kilometers from where Suzanne lived. A man fishing on the San Joaquin River spotted something unusual in the water. Upon closer inspection from his boat, he discovered the naked body of a girl, washed up by the riverbank near a bridge. The man immediately alerted the police. The body was retrieved and sent for forensic analysis. Although it had been in the water for several days and had begun to decompose, the decomposition was not severe enough to erase all evidence related to the case. The forensic expert determined that the girl had been abused, and her death was caused by a stab wound to the chest. The victim had no identification or personal belongings that could help identify her. Authorities began checking local missing person reports and found one from the Bombardier family that stood out. Due to the warm season and the body's exposure to water, the body had swollen, making identification difficult. Ultimately, dental records confirmed the victim was Suzanne Bombardier. The forensic team collected evidence related to the crime and made attempts to study the perpetrator, but the technology of the 1980s was limited. At the time, there was no database to compare information, so law enforcement could only file the collected evidence and continue the search. Suzanne's disappearance was later classified as a murder investigation, with two main suspects identified: a man with a history of violence who lived near Stephanie's home, and Stephanie's ex-boyfriend, who had been behaving erratically. Before Suzanne disappeared, he had begged Stephanie for a second chance, but left shortly after being rejected. There were no other suspicious individuals within Suzanne's circle who might have had access to her. Detectives carefully investigated both suspects, but found no solid evidence, no witnesses, fingerprints, or anything to directly link them to the crime. Eventually, the leads were dropped, and efforts to find the killer failed. The case materials were archived, leaving Suzanne's murder unsolved for years. 14-year-old Suzanne Bombardier was buried in Lafayette, leaving her family devastated. The tragedy deeply affected her mother, who fainted upon learning her daughter's body had been found. The blow was made even crueler when, shortly after the terrible news, Suzanne's school report card arrived, showing only excellent grades. The community was shaken and outraged by the failure to find her killer. Concerned citizens often called the police station with leads, but none of them proved to be useful. Over the years, investigators tried several times to analyze the criminal's DNA found on Suzanne's body. In the 1990s, despite progress in building DNA databases, poor sample quality and limited technology hampered the process. By the 2000s, the case had faded from public memory, remembered only by Suzanne's family and community elders determined to see justice served. In 2014, local journalist Jennifer Kathleen Gibbons learned about the case and was shocked that the killer had never been caught and might still be free. She located Suzanne's grave and started blogging about the crime, speaking in depth with Suzanne's family, residents, and retired detectives. Her regular posts reignited public interest in the case, sparking questions about why the killer remained unpunished, although the police have not given up on the case. Jennifer's posts have increased public pressure, prompting the police to step up their investigation to find answers. In 2015, a newly formed cold case task force revisited Suzanne Bombardier's murder. Several police officers requested the sheriff's approval and resources to address this tragic unsolved case. DNA samples from Suzanne's case were retrieved from the archives, and the team, consisting of dedicated law enforcement professionals, began the challenging work of reviewing the decades-old evidence. Suzanne's case was the oldest unsolved violent crime in Antioch. The timing of the investigation was deliberate, as advancements in forensic technology could now analyze degraded or limited DNA samples, tools that hadn't been available during the original investigation. With renewed hope and determination, investigators sought to finally bring Suzanne's killer to justice. Nearly 40-year-old evidence was sent to the San Mateo County Medical Examiner's Lab, enabling investigators, for the first time, to create a complete DNA profile of the killer. Previous efforts had failed due to inadequate technology, but this time was different. In early 2017, armed with the DNA profile, investigators compared it to a database of registered criminals. To their surprise, the results pointed to Mitchell Lynn Bacon, a major breakthrough in the case. Initially skeptical, detectives conducted additional tests, cross-checking the profile with the FBI DNA database. The results confirmed a match. Mitchell Lynn Bacon, born on March 21, 1954, in a small town near Racine, California. He had lived in Antioch, where he crossed paths with Stephanie and Suzanne. He had long been a suspect in Suzanne's murder, but a lack of evidence had prevented charges until now. In 1973, Mitchell had been convicted of multiple crimes, including assault, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Though the charges could have warranted life imprisonment, leniency was granted due to his lack of a prior record. After serving his sentence, he was arrested again in 1981 for more violent crimes and received a 24-year prison sentence. His offenses primarily involved abuse. Upon his release, he was required to register as an abuser offender, but failed to do so. This violation led to another 4-year prison sentence in 2002, officially entering him into criminal databases. When police tracked down 63-year-old Mitchell in 2017, he was still living in Antioch. He was arrested calmly as he returned from the store. Despite overwhelming evidence, he denied any involvement in Suzanne's murder. After his arrest, detectives held a press conference, announcing plans to compare his DNA to other unsolved cases. By the time of his capture, he had lived unpunished for 37 years. His methods resembled those of a serial killer, prompting suspicions that he might be linked to additional murders. For Suzanne's family, justice finally seemed within reach. One of the key obstacles to convicting Mitchell in 1980 had been his alibi. He claimed he had been with his aunt at a bar in a nearby town, far from Suzanne's babysitting location. According to him, he left the bar around 2 a.m., stopped at an intersection, visited a convenience store where the clerk recognized him, and then drove home. His aunt and the store clerk both corroborated his story, creating a plausible, albeit tight, timeline that cast doubt on his involvement. This alibi prevented investigators from conclusively linking him to the crime, even though he was considered the most likely suspect. Stephanie, however, had long believed Mitchell was involved in her cousin Suzanne's murder. As someone who had interacted with the family during their brief relationship, Mitchell had earned Suzanne's trust, a trust that tragically sealed her fate. On the night of the murder, she unknowingly let him in, unaware of the danger he posed. Stephanie had ended her relationship with Mitchell after just 3 dates, finding him unsettling. After their breakup, Mitchell began regularly visiting the restaurant where she worked, sitting at a nearby table and silently watching her without ordering anything. His alarming behavior foreshadowed the darker truth that would come to light decades later. Stephanie felt intimidated by Mitchell's behavior and chose to cut off all contact with him. However, he refused to leave her alone. He left notes on her doorstep and repeatedly showed up at her workplace, attempting to reconnect. Stephanie later learned that one of her colleagues had given him her home address. The colleague claimed ignorance of their breakup, but this act put Suzanne in danger and ultimately led to her kidnapping, abuse, and murder. In 1980, during the investigation, Mitchell was offered a polygraph test, which he agreed to take. However, the results were inconclusive. Despite multiple interrogations, Mitchell never confessed, and due to insufficient evidence, he couldn't be definitively linked to the crime. Finally, 37 years later, he was arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, and abuse. A forensic expert couldn't determine whether Suzanne had been abused before or after her murder. The prosecutor debated whether to pursue life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty. Mitchell continued to deny his involvement in the murder. Ultimately, the prosecution opted for life imprisonment, as seeking the death penalty could result in prolonged legal battles and appeals. In such cases, defense lawyers often file repeated appeals, forcing the victim's family to continually relive the tragedy. Additionally, given Mitchell's age, it was uncertain whether he would live long enough to face execution. Once the decision for a life sentence was made, an official reconstruction of events followed. The prosecution argued that Mitchell coerced Suzanne into leaving her house since she would never have abandoned her young nieces under any circumstances. It was believed that Mitchell threatened Suzanne with a knife, forcing her to leave her home. Her family believed she sacrificed herself to protect her nieces from harm. According to the prosecution, Suzanne was killed with a knife that had a blade at least 15 centimeters long. The blade was sharp enough to pierce her heart with a single fatal strike, causing near-instant death. The prosecution also contended that Mitchell used the same knife to threaten her during the abduction. After committing the crime, he disposed of Suzanne's body. It is believed that Mitchell took Suzanne to a remote location, where he abused her and then killed her with immense force, nearly piercing her body completely. The prosecution argued that Mitchell abused her again after her death. The defense took an unusual approach. They argued, citing a state law that imposes a lighter sentence for abuse of a corpse, that the abuse occurred after Suzanne was dead, and that Mitchell was not involved in her kidnapping or murder. Instead, they claimed he found Suzanne's lifeless body and took advantage of the situation. This argument was strengthened by the lack of evidence proving Suzanne's abduction. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle at Stephanie's home, giving the defense room to create doubt. However, the prosecution still had critical evidence to counter these claims. Mitchell's criminal history followed a clear and troubling pattern across several recorded incidents. In 1973, he was arrested after being suspected of abuse an underage girl during a burglary. During the investigation, it was revealed that he was guilty of another crime, which led to charges of abuse, burglary, and assault with intent to kill. Following his release, he broke into another home in a different city, where he committed robbery and abused a schoolgirl. During the assault, he tied up the victim, burned her with a cigarette, and stabbed her with a knife. Miraculously, the girl survived. The victim recalled Mitchell's unsettling behavior during the attack He appeared to enjoy his actions immensely, humming and laughing to himself like a deranged individual. The physical and emotional scars left on the survivor required a long recovery. Prosecutors argued that the similarities between these crimes provided significant evidence linking him to the kidnapping and murder of Suzanne Bombardier. The trial for Suzanne's case was set for March 2022. After Mitchell's arrest, a press conference highlighted the persistent efforts of the detectives who had volunteered to investigate Antioche's oldest case. The police also credited the media's role in keeping Suzanne's story alive through reports published in 2015 and 2016. Authorities stressed the possibility of Mitchell being involved in other violent crimes around the U.S. In their appeal to the public, they urged anyone with information about his involvement in other crimes to contact the Antioche Police Department. They reassured people that Mitchell was now in custody and posed no threat, encouraging past victims or witnesses to come forward. However, no one responded to their call for information. The trial concluded on March 15, 2022, when the jury unanimously convicted Mitchell Lynn Bacon of first-degree murder, as well as other charges such as robbery, kidnapping, and abuse. On June 27, 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During his sentencing hearing, a chilling revelation emerged. A former prisoner claims Mitchell confessed to systematically abusing and killing escort girls while working as a truck driver, traveling across the country for years. Authorities are currently investigating these claims to uncover evidence of these alleged crimes. However, Mitchell has denied these accusations, calling his former cellmate's story a fabrication. The search for truth continues as authorities work to determine whether Mitchell is responsible for more atrocities. On the night before Halloween, October 30th, 2001, police were called to a home in the affluent Coral Gables neighborhood of Florida after an alarm was triggered. Upon arrival, officers uncovered a horrifying crime scene. A woman was found brutally murdered on her kitchen floor in what looked like a scene from a horror movie. Blood covered the walls, with splatters even reaching the ceiling, a clear indication of extreme violence. Investigators determined that the victim, 45 years old Maggie Lacaio, had been attacked after parking her car in her open garage. It appeared that the assailant had been waiting for her and struck as she exited the car. Though she managed to flee into the house, the attacker pursued her and ended her life there. Maggie was the estranged wife of Edward Lacaio, to whom she had been married for nearly 30 years. They had recently separated and had not been living together for months. Maggie had even attempted to file a restraining order against Edward. Their separation was part of a contentious divorce, driven largely by Edward's repeated infidelities. The process was further complicated by serious disputes over financial matters, making him the immediate prime suspect. Maggie and Edward had met in 1972 while studying accounting at the University of Miami. After graduating, they married and worked as accountants. In 1982, Maggie became a homemaker following the birth of their son, Eddie Jr. Over time, Edward climbed the professional ladder, founding his own company and managing the finances of wealthy Miami clients. Unlike Edward, who was sociable and charismatic, Maggie was described as more private and reserved. In 1992, they purchased a mansion in prestigious Coral Gables, but by 2001, Edward had moved into an apartment in South Beach, just 10 minutes away by car. When police contacted Edward, they withheld the true nature of the situation and told him only that there had been an issue at his former home due to an alarm. They asked him to come by to assist. Edward arrived shortly afterward, appearing calm and cooperative as he spoke with investigators. He displayed no concern or curiosity about why the area was surrounded by police tape or why there were so many officers present. His indifference was notable, especially given that his estranged wife Maggie still lived at the house. Detectives eventually brought him to the station for further questioning. During his interview, Edward explained that he and Maggie were going through a divorce and had stopped interacting. He acknowledged that their relationship had been strained, with disagreements escalating to the point where Maggie had sought a restraining order against him for alleged threats, domestic violence, and abusive behavior. The first hearing related to their divorce was scheduled for the next morning. When police finally informed Edward that Maggie had been murdered, he showed no visible reaction. Meanwhile, Edward and Maggie's 19-year-old son, Eddie, was also being questioned in another room at the station. Eddie stated that he had been at the library that evening, and his alibi was confirmed. After the interrogations, Eddie crossed paths with his father in the corridor. Unlike Edward, who remained emotionless, Eddie displayed visible anger and disbelief. Later, Eddie told reporters that at that moment, he became convinced his father was responsible for his mother's murder. Tensions between Eddie and his father had already been high in recent years, and this tragic event only deepened the divide between them. Eddie openly despised his father, viewing him as a personification of the worst human traits. Despite Eddie's doubts, Edward claimed he had spent the day playing golf and was in his apartment on South Beach, several kilometers from the crime scene. At the time of the alleged murder, CCTV footage from his apartment confirmed his alibi, proving he couldn't have been the killer. Even though Edward was quickly ruled out as the perpetrator, the police remained suspicious of him. He had a strong motive for wanting Maggie dead, and the violent nature of the crime suggested hatred, likely from someone close to her. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have hired someone to carry out the murder. While reviewing the details of the case, a detective recalled seeing a white pickup truck making an illegal maneuver near Maggie's house on the night of the murder. Although he had wanted to stop the driver, he was responding to an emergency call at Maggie's residence. Now, he suspected the truck's driver might have been fleeing the crime scene. When asked if he knew anyone who owned a white pickup truck, Edward denied it. The investigation intensified, and the next day, a local resident contacted authorities about a small sports bag found in the bushes between his property and Maggie's house. The bag turned out to be crucial evidence. Inside were a blood-stained knife, bloody clothing, and Maggie's stolen credit cards. The bag was sent to a crime lab for analysis, where investigators hoped to find DNA, fibers, or fingerprints to identify the killer. 2 days after Maggie's death, Edward reported a break-in at his office. Police found no evidence of theft, but the office was in disarray, with documents scattered on the floor, taking advantage of the situation. Detectives interviewed Edward's employees about him and his family. A worker revealed that Edward's brother, Maggie Lacaio, owned a white pickup truck, the same type of vehicle spotted near the crime scene. This revelation marked a turning point in the investigation. Michael, who lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, was quickly located by police. His truck immediately attracted attention because the seats had just been upholstered. When police removed the seat covers, they found the old fabric was stained and showed signs of having been pressure washed, possibly to remove evidence such as blood, since a complete clean was not possible. The seats were upholstered with new fabric. Unlike Edward, Michael had a troubled history. At 41 years old, he was unemployed, struggling with a banned substance addiction, and had a prior fraud conviction. It seemed plausible that he might commit murder, particularly if motivated by a banned substance or financial gain. Although no incriminating evidence directly connected Michael to the crime scene, the sports bag near Maggie's house became a critical clue. Latex gloves inside the bag contained Michael's DNA. Tests ruled out Edward and Eddie, confirming Michael as the likely suspect. 2 weeks after Maggie's murder, the lab results were finalized, and Michael was charged with killing Maggie. Eddie was shocked to learn that his uncle, Michael, was involved in the incident. He suspected that Michael could not have acted alone, because how could someone who lives so far away travel so far just to commit a crime? Eddie suspected there was more to the story and thought his father might somehow be connected. Regardless, the police needed concrete evidence to prove anything further. While there was no direct evidence implicating Edward, his brother, Michael was preparing to stand trial. Meanwhile, Edward continued with his everyday life, going to work and even dating. Michael faced murder charges, with prosecutors hoping he would confess and implicate Edward, who was believed, according to Eddie, to be the mastermind behind the crime. Prosecutors were confident they could uncover the truth, especially given that Michael faced the death penalty if convicted. Despite strong pressure, Michael firmly refused to plead guilty or testify against Edward, asserting his innocence. During the trial, prosecutors made it clear they believed both Michael and Edward were involved. However, this did not change Michael's stance. Although the prosecution presented strong evidence against Michael, much of it was circumstantial. His defense lawyer argued that the evidence was questionable due to procedural errors during the investigation and lab work. Furthermore, there was no clear motive, and much of the case relied on indirect evidence. Despite these arguments, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before finding Michael guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, a punishment likely designed to pressure him into confessing or exposing Edward's role in the crime. After the verdict, Eddie stepped in, determined to fight what he saw as an unjust decision. At just 19 years old, Eddie had already graduated from college and was attending the University of Miami Medical School, where he excelled academically. His relationship with his father, Edward, had always been strained. He never even called him Dad, referring to him as Ed instead. He pursued his studies with one key purpose: to help his mother, Maggie, escape her abusive marriage. Despite his efforts, he was unable to save her. However, he gained financial independence and tried to help her secure a divorce. Starting with a court injunction against Edward, Eddie believed his father's refusal to split their assets fairly was at the heart of the conflict. Under Florida law, divorcing spouses were required to divide their wealth equally. Edward, whose fortune was estimated at $6 million, refused to comply. He even tried to hide some of his wealth, but Maggie, an experienced accountant, discovered his deception and was determined to expose it. According to Eddie, Maggie was murdered because she was planning to reveal Edward's hidden accounts to the court just hours before their divorce trial began. The day after her murder, Edward's lawyer petitioned the court to terminate the divorce proceedings due to Maggie's death, a move that struck many as suspicious and calculating. With the case dismissed, Edward stood to retain control of all the family assets. Eddie was horrified by his father's cold reaction to his mother's death. He seemed entirely unbothered, despite having been married to her for years. Edward's greed and lack of remorse convinced Eddie that his father was responsible for the murder. Seeking justice, Eddie filed a civil lawsuit to block Edward from taking complete control of the family fortune and won the case. However, he faced significant challenges with the criminal investigation, which stalled for years. After 4 years with no progress, prosecutors doubted they would ever uncover the truth. Everything changed in November 2005, when authorities decided to move forward with the evidence they had, believing no new leads would emerge. Edward Lacaio was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to murder his wife, Maggie. Eddie saw this as a significant victory, but it was just the start of a much tougher battle. After spending 4 years securing a conviction against his uncle Michael for his mother's murder, Eddie now faced the challenge of bringing his father, Edward, to justice. This trial was far more complex due to the absence of direct evidence. In Michael's case, the crime scene held undeniable proof, including DNA and the murder weapon. However, Edward's charges rested solely on circumstantial evidence, giving his defense team considerable room to argue. The prosecution claimed Edward orchestrated Maggie's murder due to a strong financial motive. During their divorce proceedings, Edward stood to lose a large portion of his assets. Although he had hidden much of his wealth in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Maggie had uncovered the deception and planned to expose him in court. Unwilling to let this happen, Edward allegedly convinced his brother Michael to carry out the murder. Prosecutors argued that Edward had not only planned the killing, but had also influenced Michael to commit the brutal act. Graphic photos revealed the horrifying nature of Maggie's death. She had been savagely attacked with both a knife and a baton. She suffered multiple blunt force injuries that caused fractures, and the assailant had continued stabbing her even after the initial beating. The prosecution contended that this extreme violence stemmed directly from Edward's malicious intent. With little concrete evidence tying Edward to the crime, the case relied on motive, circumstantial evidence, and key witness testimonies. The first major point of suspicion came from Edward's lack of reaction when he was informed of Maggie's death. Although there was no written or recorded evidence of a conspiracy between Edward and Michael, phone records showed a spike in the number of calls between the brothers in the weeks leading up to the murder. Previously, they had only communicated occasionally on special occasions, but records showed that they had begun calling each other on an unusually daily basis 6 weeks before Maggie's death. This sudden change became a major point of suspicion for investigators. The prosecution argued that Edward used these calls to pressure Michael into committing the crime and to finalize the plan. A critical witness was Edward's secretary, Gudile Gonzalez, who testified that she overheard several phone calls between Edward and Michael. After realizing the nature of these conversations, Gudile said Edward began threatening her, warning her to stay silent or risk being killed. Frightened, she eventually went to the police. Eddie, Edward and Maggie's son, also took the stand, recounting years of abuse Maggie suffered during her marriage. He described instances in which Edward had beaten his mother, threatened her, and even came close to hitting her with a heavy sculpture. According to Eddie, Edward openly threatened to kill Maggie 5 months before her death, after she revealed her intention to file for divorce. Tensions escalated when Maggie caught Edward having an affair with Eleanor Salazar, a masseuse. Eleanor also testified in court, stating that she was at Edward's house at around 11:30 p.m. on the night of the murder and witnessed a conversation between Edward and Michael. Surveillance footage from Edward's house supported Eleanor's account. The video showed Michael arriving at Edward's home around midnight, drenched and visibly distressed. He was seen gesturing wildly, which the prosecution interpreted as a sign that he had just finished cleaning blood out of his truck. Eleanor further testified that Edward later threatened her, warning that she would suffer a fate worse than Maggie's if she went to the authorities. Surveillance footage partially verified Edward's whereabouts that night. While bolstering Eleanor's credibility, financial records also uncovered Edward's multi-million-dollar offshore accounts, which he had concealed during the divorce to limit what Maggie could claim. This financial evidence reinforced the prosecution's claim about Edward's motive, emphasizing that Maggie's knowledge of his hidden assets posed a serious threat to him. Edward's behavior after the murder raised serious concerns. He quickly moved on with his life, even starting a new relationship. During an argument with his new girlfriend, Edward allegedly threatened her, stating that she would end up like his wife. Alarmed by this threat, she decided to report it to the police. In court, the prosecution presented a gruesome reconstruction of the murder. Using a mannequin, they demonstrated how Michael brutally attacked Maggie. She suffered 8 blows to the head with a metal baton, but remained conscious and tried to defend herself. The assault bent the baton, rendering it useless. Maggie sustained severe defensive injuries, including nearly losing a finger while trying to protect herself. Despite her resistance, Michael continued his attack, pinning her against a wall and eventually standing on her chest to ensure her death. Blood evidence found throughout the house supported the prosecution's narrative. However, Edward's defense focused on the lack of direct evidence linking him to a conspiracy with Michael. There were no written or recorded agreements or explicit discussions about the crime. However, the prosecution asserted that Edward had a clear motive, suspicious behavior, and personality, and called on the jury to consider the circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Following the murder, no money was transferred to Michael, and Edward did not provide him with any support while he was in prison. Michael appeared to gain nothing from the crime and had no clear motive to kill Maggie. Initially, investigators speculated that the killer might have had a secret relationship with Maggie, but there was no evidence to confirm this, as they had no prior contact. Edward's lawyer argued that the attack was random, possibly driven by Michael's mental state or substance abuse. In contrast, the prosecution maintained that Edward had strong motives to want his wife gone. Adding to the complexity, Edward's defense painted him as a kind and loving husband and father. They presented photos of a happy family life and called witnesses to attest to his character. The defense also attempted to shift the narrative by suggesting that Eddie, Edward's own son, may have had a financial motive to target his father in order to inherit the family's wealth. The most damaging testimony came from Edward's secretary, Goodallay. She testified that Edward had threatened her and stated that Michael would kill Maggie. The defense countered by arguing that Goodallay's story had changed multiple times, which weakened her credibility. The prosecution explained her inconsistencies as stemming from her discomfort with Edward's explicit and obscene language, which she rephrased for the jury. Nevertheless, her changing story raised questions about her reliability. Further complicating the situation, the defense pointed out that Goodallay was in a long-term romantic relationship with the lead detective on the case, which raised ethical concerns. By the time of Edward's trial, she had been living with the detective for over a year. The defense argued that this relationship undermined her testimony, suggesting that her involvement was part of a deliberate effort to bias the case against Edward. Another key point presented by the prosecution was the 39 phone calls exchanged between Edward and Michael over the course of 6 weeks. Previously, the brothers had little to no contact, often going years without speaking. The content of these calls remains unknown. The defense argued that the calls were innocent, suggesting that the brothers had simply grown closer during Edward's divorce proceedings. However, the dramatic increase in communication heightened the suspicion surrounding Edward's involvement. The argument that Edward had a financial motive for murder was dismissed. Even if he had lost half of his assets in a divorce, he would still have remained a millionaire, making it illogical for him to take such a drastic action. The defense also claimed that Michael, due to his struggles with addiction and mental health issues, might have committed the crime without having a clear motive. They suggested Michael could have misinterpreted Edward's frustration over the divorce and acted impulsively against Maggie. Furthermore, the defense argued that Michael's unstable nature would have made it unlikely for him to remain silent and not implicate Edward, especially when facing the death penalty. After both sides presented their cases, the jury deliberated for several days. The case was challenging, as it relied primarily on circumstantial evidence. Initially, the jury debated Edward's and Michael's motives, but eventually focused on Edward's potential financial incentives and Michael's apparent lack of motive. On the third day of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. Edward Lacaio was found guilty of first-degree murder. His son, Eddie, and his grandmother were present at the sentencing. Eddie expressed relief over the verdict, feeling that justice had finally been served after 6 long years since his mother's death. Although Edward initially faced the possibility of the death penalty, the jury recommended a life sentence without parole, which was ultimately imposed. Given Edward's age, this effectively meant he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. However, the decision enraged Eddie, who firmly believed that the death penalty would have been more appropriate. 6 months into his imprisonment, Edward gave an interview where he continued to proclaim his innocence. He denied encouraging his brother Michael to commit the murder, claiming that he had hoped to reconcile with Maggie before her death. He insisted he never believed Michael was capable of such a brutal crime and alleged that both he and Michael had been framed. Michael also maintained his innocence and never confessed. Nevertheless, DNA evidence confirmed his involvement, and the timing of the murder, just before a contentious divorce hearing, was difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. During the interview, Edward suggested that his son, Eddie, may have orchestrated the crime. He theorized that Eddie, eager to inherit his parents' fortune, might have set him up to take the blame. Edward reiterated that the divorce settlement would not have left him destitute, leaving him no reason to kill Maggie. Eddie strongly denied these accusations. Edward Lacaio later passed away on August 30th, 2018, at the age of 67 in a prison hospital in Lake Butler, Florida. The home where the murder occurred was eventually sold for $3 million. Eddie went on to become a doctor, dedicating his life to helping others. A loud argument broke out in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Neighbors were used to the screams coming from the house, but tonight it was different. The sounds of screaming, banging, and muffled sobbing grew louder, as if signaling something was about to go too far. Then, just a few minutes later, a call came through the emergency line. The voice on the other end was shaky and broken, as if the caller was in a state of confusion and despair. It was the beginning of one of the most controversial cases the town of Dubuque had ever seen. Dubuque, a city stretched along the banks of the Mississippi River, at first glance looks like a classic Midwestern town with rolling hills, historic districts, and postcard charm. But beneath that surface lies a complicated history. For decades, Dubuque was known as a stronghold of a notorious hate group with deep roots in the region. In the 1922, the group was highly influential, organizing rallies, pressuring local officials, and gaining open support from many white residents. This troubling legacy left scars on the city's social fabric. Entire neighborhoods were divided along racial lines. African American families were pushed into specific areas, and for years, schools and jobs remained largely inaccessible to minorities. Even into the late 20th century, federal reports listed Dubuque as one of the least welcoming places in the country for Black Americans. During the 1982 and 1990s, tensions flared again. Threatening graffiti appeared. Homes were targeted with arson, and city leaders were forced to roll out anti-discrimination programs. Still, even in the 21st century, hostility lingered. From street-level aggression to inflammatory posts online, the contrast between Dubuque's picturesque image and its deeper social struggles has always been striking. On one side, historic churches, a respected university, and breathtaking views of the Mississippi. On the other, a legacy of racial intolerance, social friction, and long-standing mistrust between communities. It was in this atmosphere of prejudice and unspoken conflict that a story unfolded, one that would soon draw national attention. Fontaine Buo grew up in Dubuque in a well-regarded family, was known from a young age for his love of sports and natural social charisma. His confidence and charm made him a popular figure among his friends throughout high school and into college. Samantha Link's story was different. Raised in a household that valued hard work, discipline, she turned to athletics early on, pushing herself to prove her strength and determination. In her teens, she was diagnosed with mental health conditions that required ongoing medical supervision and daily medication. While the treatments helped her maintain balance, they also caused mood swings, occasional irritability. She had also endured difficult past relationships marked by control and emotional pressure. That history left deep scars, a fear of losing control, a constant need for reassurance. Outwardly, Though Samantha appeared energetic, someone with clear goals and the willpower to chase them. They first met at a party hosted by their mutual friend Cassie. The night was filled with music and laughter, a seemingly ordinary gathering that turned into a pivotal moment. Fontaine was in his element, cracking jokes, drawing people in with his charm. Samantha watched him with a mix of caution and curiosity. When they finally spoke, it quickly became clear they shared similar interests and values. It was obvious something was sparking between them. Within days, casual texts and evening walks blossomed into something more serious. Before long, they decided to move in together. Their friends were surprised at how quickly things escalated. It was as if they had skipped the getting-to-know-you stage entirely and jumped straight into a full-blown commitment. But under one roof, their differences became hard to ignore. Samantha craved stability and a calm home environment where her emotional well-being was prioritized. Fontaine, however, clung to his familiar lifestyle, late nights, parties, and constant outings with friends. What felt like neglect to her seemed completely normal to him. Initially, their differences seemed like complementary opposites, creating a fragile sense of balance. However, as time passed, their different needs created problems in the relationship. Their contrasting ideas about what a partnership meant slowly damaged their connection. To outsiders, they still looked like the picture-perfect couple. Fontaine, the charismatic figure who drew attention everywhere he went, and Samantha, the quiet, grounding presence at his side. But those closer to them began to notice early red flags. Samantha grew increasingly uneasy about Fontaine's openness with other women. He, in turn, brushed off her concerns with laughter, dismissing them as jealousy, which only deepened her distrust. On the surface, their relationship remained intact. They still talked about the future, stood by each other during difficult times, and tried to maintain closeness. But beneath that facade, tension was quietly building. For Samantha, being with Fontaine meant a chance at stability, a reliable partner she could depend on. For him, it was more about excitement, attention, and connection. These mismatched intentions became increasingly obvious to those around them. The strain soon began to take its toll. Samantha's life was tightly bound to her medication schedule and regular medical checkups. But Fontaine didn't always take this seriously. He believed his role was to support her during the hard moments, but not to structure his entire life around her needs. Minor frustrations began to stack up. His tardiness, broken promises, and carefree acceptance of party invitations even when she wasn't feeling well. Her sharp reactions often sounded to him like relentless criticism, which he dismissed as overdramatic. She asked more frequently about their future, hoping for reassurance. While he deflected, unwilling to commit to specifics, her anxiety grew, and with it, his irritation. Still, the bond between them didn't disappear. This push and pull, deep attachment, mixed with rising frustration, became the defining pattern of their relationship. After yet another heated argument, Samantha left to stay with her mother, hoping distance would give her clarity. Eventually, though, they agreed to return home together. The car ride back was suffocating, long stretches of silence broken by bursts of blame. Neither wanted to be the first to back down. For Fontaine, this reconciliation felt like a crossroads. He was beginning to realize the relationship had reached its breaking point. Samantha, on the other hand, couldn't hide her anger and pressed him relentlessly, escalating every conversation. Back at the house, peace was short-lived. Within hours, another argument erupted. Samantha demanded proof of his commitment, pleading for reassurance that he was serious about a long-term future. Fontaine answered with cold detachment, saying her expectations were unrealistic and that he felt trapped by her demands. Soon after, he made a decision. Ending the relationship was, in his mind, the only way to escape the emotional weight pressing down on him. He told her directly he no longer saw a future for them. For Samantha, the breakup was devastating. She had built her stability around him and wasn't ready to let go. As emotions spiraled, a new blow landed, a video posted by Fontaine. Speaking directly to his audience, he made remarks that could easily be interpreted as thinly veiled references to their problems. To Samantha, it felt like mockery, his way of dismissing her and airing their struggles in public. For her, it was undeniable proof he had no intention of reconciling. What began as emotional strain quickly escalated into confrontation. During one heated dispute, Fontaine reportedly told Samantha he wanted her out of the house, that her presence had become unbearable. This wasn't just a moment of anger. That moment marked a critical tipping point. With his video circulating and their fights intensifying, the fragile balance between them was about to shatter. Later, Fontaine claimed that after their heated argument, Samantha, overwhelmed and emotionally unstable, impulsively grabbed a kitchen knife and injured herself. He insisted it was an act of self-harm, not violence from him. According to his account, he even tried to stop her but failed. But the scene first responders encountered told a very different story. Paramedics arrived to find Samantha lifeless on the kitchen floor, bearing 3 stab wounds to vital areas. The placement of her body and the nature of the wounds simply did not align with Fontaine's version. While medics worked desperately to save her, officers observed Fontaine closely. What they saw was not shock or grief, but hostility. Witnesses later recalled him shouting at police, arguing with them, and displaying aggressive, confrontational behavior. To officers, it was a clear signal this was no mere domestic dispute. It was something far more serious. Once in custody, Fontaine's statements immediately raised red flags. When pressed for details about the timing of events and his exact actions, his answers were vague, inconsistent, and often shifted under scrutiny. Detectives quickly suspected he was concealing the truth. Then came the most damning discovery: his phone. A recording captured just before the incident revealed a tense atmosphere filled with threats and aggression from Fontaine. Far from calm or composed, his voice dripped with hostility. The tone of the video stood in stark contrast to his claim that he had only tried to protect Samantha, shredding his credibility. Text messages recovered from the device added another layer. They showed days of heated arguments, accusations, and emotional tension. The incident was clearly the culmination of ongoing turmoil. Medical examiners reinforced this conclusion. They determined Samantha's injuries were consistent with a violent struggle, not self-inflicted wounds. The angle, depth, and force of the stabs made the prospect of self-harm virtually impossible. Investigators gathered more evidence from neighbors and nearby security cameras. Multiple residents reported hearing terrified screams that night. Every new piece of testimony pointed away from self-harm and toward a brutal confrontation. Fontaine's explanation now looked less like truth and more like a hastily constructed defense. From the very beginning, Samantha's family had voiced their doubts. They told investigators she had never expressed self-harm thoughts and was focused on her future. Her mother, especially, emphasized that Samantha had plans, goals, and no history of impulsive self-harm. Their testimony directly contradicted Fontaine's attempt to paint her as unstable. As the investigation deepened, public reaction intensified. Local media covered the story closely, and on social media, outrage spread rapidly. Many in the community saw Fontaine's narrative as a desperate attempt to deflect blame. For Samantha's loved ones, it was not just about disproving his claims, it was about demanding justice. What began as a domestic dispute had now escalated into one of the most scrutinized criminal cases in the area. Each revelation fueled public anger and strengthened the resolve of Samantha's family, ensuring the case would not fade quietly but remain a test of truth, justice, and accountability. A series of meticulous forensic examinations were commissioned in an effort to clarify the circumstances of the tragedy. Medical specialists carefully assessed the wounds sustained by Samantha Link, noting striking details. The injuries varied in depth, direction, and force, suggesting multiple blows delivered during a struggle. Psychological evaluations added further weight to the findings. Records showed that Samantha had never been diagnosed with a serious mental disorder, nor was she under ongoing psychiatric observation. There was no documented history of instability that could support the claim she had acted in a sudden breakdown. These conclusions marked a turning point in the investigation. Combined with the digital evidence and testimony from friends and neighbors, they dismantled the defense's early narrative. The consensus among experts was unequivocal. The theory that Samantha harmed herself was implausible. For prosecutors, it was the foundation they needed to push the case toward trial with renewed confidence. When the trial of Fontaine Buo commenced in Rockwell County, Texas, anticipation was high. Locals were unfamiliar with such a sensational case. The court was packed with onlookers, reporters, and local residents eager to witness the proceedings. The judge presided, a figure known for his rigid style and no-nonsense rulings. His choice to restrict discussion about Samantha's prior psychological consultations sparked immediate debate. By prohibiting references to her visits with mental health professionals, he effectively blocked the jury from hearing evidence that might have offered a fuller understanding of her emotional state. Many legal observers criticized the ruling as a limitation that tilted the balance of the case. In the courtroom, the prosecution leaned heavily on science. They highlighted bruises on Samantha's arms and shoulders, injuries that clearly pointed to restraint or physical conflict rather than voluntary harm. Crime scene photographs revealed a kitchen in disarray, with blood patterns that supported the scenario of a violent struggle. These details left jurors with a vivid image of the chaos that had unfolded. The defense countered with a familiar strategy, portraying Fontaine as a man trapped in an escalating situation. They argued he had acted in self-defense after Samantha lashed out during an emotional outburst. Text messages were presented as evidence of her volatility. But those arguments were steadily eroded by witnesses who painted a different picture. Samantha's friends testified she was looking ahead, discussing a new job opportunity and planning an upcoming trip. Evidence that directly contradicted claims she was unstable or preparing to harm herself. The most dramatic moment came when prosecutors played an audio recording recovered from Fontaine's phone. His voice could be heard, sharp and cutting. To the prosecution, this was the sound of frustration boiling over, a precursor to violence. The defense tried to minimize its significance, calling it a casual remark taken out of context. However, both the jury and the public seemed to interpret the recording as part of a larger pattern of tension and conflict. Meanwhile, Fontaine's conduct on the stand left jurors uneasy. He stumbled over timelines, contradicted earlier statements, and often refused to give direct answers. Each inconsistency further damaged his credibility, reinforcing the prosecution's portrait of a man trying to obscure the truth rather than reveal it. As proceedings dragged on, the divide between prosecution and defense sharpened. One side presented a case built on consistency, expert testimony, and hard evidence. The other leaned on speculation and selective interpretation. But the most decisive battles took place behind closed doors. Jury deliberations quickly grew heated, with members split between doubt and certainty. Some pressed for conviction, citing the overwhelming medical evidence, while others hesitated, swayed by lingering questions. Reports later surfaced of intense internal pressure. A letter written by juror admitted he felt coerced not only by more assertive jurors, but also by the judge, who repeatedly urged them to reach consensus rather than deadlock. The judge's role itself became a focal point. Far from remaining neutral, he was seen pushing the jury toward unity, interrupting defense attorneys, and shutting down lines of questioning that might have benefited Fontaine. Journalists covering the trial described a courtroom where judicial authority sometimes overshadowed fairness, creating an imbalance that would later resurface during appeals. The public's interest in the case intensified outside the courthouse. Samantha's family spoke often to the media, portraying her as a victim of manipulation and violence, and Fontaine as the perpetrator. Local newspapers published emotional stories about Samantha's last days, with quotes from friends, family highlighting her kindness and strength. A critical moment arrived when previously undisclosed messages from Samantha's personal conversations were introduced in court. These texts revealed her intention to leave the relationship and focus on building a new future for herself. For prosecutors, it was devastating to the defense's claims. Any suggestion that she was unstable or incapable of making decisions collapsed under the weight of her own words. The jury was no longer weighing competing versions of events. They were already considering the severity of the punishment. Internal pressure within the jury room and the judge's firm stance had shifted the momentum firmly toward the prosecution. After weeks of testimony, forensic evidence, and conflicting legal arguments, the courtroom braced for the final moment. The atmosphere was tense enough to silence the crowd. The judge read the verdict aloud. Fontaine Buo was found guilty of the charges against Samantha Link and sentenced to 50 years in prison. A heavy silence filled the room, followed by a wave of mixed reactions. Fontaine didn't outwardly panic upon hearing the sentence, but the strain on his face was unmistakable. He had denied responsibility throughout the trial, and even in the face of the final ruling, he continued to maintain his innocence. His immediate response was to announce plans to appeal the decision, claiming that the evidence had been misinterpreted and that the full context of that night had not been fairly considered. Samantha's family was visibly relieved by the verdict. They felt justice had been served, though they still grieved an irreplaceable loss. Family members in the courtroom cried openly, thanked the prosecutors and the court, expressing that the verdict brought them a long-awaited sense of closure. Public reaction, however, was far more divided. Many believed the sentence was just and reflected the strength of the evidence presented. Others questioned the fairness of the trial, arguing that media pressure and courtroom imbalances had stacked the odds against Fontaine from the beginning. His supporters pointed to specific grievances, such as the controversial removal of a juror and restrictions imposed on defense, claiming the process was tainted and should have been declared a mistrial. In the weeks following sentencing, the community itself split into camps. Some viewed Fontaine as a manipulative offender who had finally been held accountable. Others saw him as a man condemned by a system, eager for a conviction. Advocacy groups began forming, calling for a review of the case, while counter voices argued that the evidence was overwhelming and that reopening the matter would only prolong the suffering of Samantha's family. Rather than closing the book, the verdict ignited a fresh round of debate. To his critics, Fontaine embodied cold-blooded violence. To his supporters, he was another casualty of a flawed judicial system. His attorneys moved quickly, filing notices of appeal and alleging serious procedural missteps. They argued that video footage used in court had been stripped of context, twisting casual remarks into sinister threats. They also claimed investigators had targeted Fontaine as the prime suspect from the beginning, refusing to explore other possibilities. The appeals court agreed to review the case, but the process promised to be long and arduous. Meanwhile, Fontaine remained behind bars, his supporters organizing rallies and online campaigns in his name. To some, it was a fight for justice. To others, it was nothing more than a desperate attempt to rewrite a verdict that had already been decided. As preparations for the appeal advanced, the defense team brought in independent experts to bolster their version of events. Forensic psychologists and criminal investigators were introduced, some of whom argued that, under extreme emotional distress, the wounds on Samantha's body could be interpreted as self-inflicted. Another specialist pointed out that there were no direct eyewitnesses to the fatal altercation, suggesting the jury had relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. The prosecution quickly countered with its own battery of experts. They emphasized the directionality of blood spatter, the precise angles of the wounds, and the position of Samantha's body in the kitchen, all details that strongly indicated the injuries had been inflicted by someone else. Meanwhile, the media shifted its focus beyond the courtroom, digging into the couple's personal history. Old social media posts resurfaced. Friends and co-workers were interviewed, and new details began to circulate. Some accounts portrayed Samantha as someone who had voiced repeated concerns about Fontaine's temper and controlling behavior. Others painted a different picture, describing her as impulsive and occasionally volatile during moments of stress. The result was a battle of interpretations, not just between lawyers, but also among experts, journalists, and the public. Some professionals argued that the case had leaned too heavily on inference and lacked a definitive smoking gun. Others maintained that the convergence of evidence, from forensic findings to text messages, made the guilty verdict both justified and necessary. This division transformed the trial into more than just a legal proceeding. It became a cultural flashpoint. Talk shows debated it nightly, editorials dissected every new revelation, and online forums buzzed with arguments from both sides. By now, the case had transcended the courtroom. Investigative journalists kept the story alive with follow-up reports, some uncovering financial disputes related to Samantha's estate, others highlighting conflicts within her family. Social media intensified the polarization, with advocacy groups springing up in support of Fontaine, convinced he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice, while opposing groups rallied to defend the verdict as a long-overdue act of accountability. In the end, the saga of Fontaine and Samantha became more than the tragic story of two people. It stood as one of the most polarizing legal battles of its time, a case that revealed cracks in the justice system, stirred debates within professional circles, and split public opinion down the middle. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed, the case remained etched into collective memory, both as a cautionary tale and as a cultural mirror reflecting society's deepest divisions. Binghamton, a small, peaceful city in New York State, was once so safe that many families did not need to lock their doors when they went to bed. Children rode their bikes, delivered newspapers, played in the parks. Adults lived slowly and trusted each other. In that place, crime seems a distant thing. But on the afternoon of March 26, 1984, that peace was shattered. A 12-year-old girl disappeared on a familiar street while delivering newspapers. The whole city was in a panic. Hundreds of people rushed to search for her, but to no avail. Until the police opened the door, leading to a dark basement in a seemingly innocuous house, they were faced with a gruesome sight. The girl's body lay there, wrapped in an old blanket, with traces of the crime imprinted on the walls. From that moment on, Binghamton was no longer mentioned as a peaceful city. So, Who was the killer, and how could such horror hide behind the walls of an ordinary home? To find the answer, stay with us until the very end of this video. Cherry Lindsay was born on June 6, 1971, in Binghamton, New York, USA. She was one of 4 children. Her father worked in law enforcement, and her mother was a homemaker. Since childhood, she has been a creative, dynamic person and actively participates in community activities. She played the clarinet in the school orchestra, enjoyed board games and softball, and even joined the school's softball team. Despite her busy schedule, she also volunteers at the neonatal unit of a local hospital and volunteers with the American Veterans Association. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, neonatologist, or nurse, and she studied and worked hard toward those goals. At age 12, she was in 7th grade and earning good grades. In her free time, Cherry took a part-time job delivering newspapers because she wanted to help others. She planned to save her earnings to throw a party for her favorite teacher, who was expecting a baby. By early 1984, she had been delivering newspapers for about a month. Following a regular route along 2 neighboring streets near her home, residents appreciated her reliability and politeness. She always delivered on time. In the 1,980 seconds, Binghamton was considered a safe city, and many people didn't lock their doors or windows. Cherry's family lives in an area with a low crime rate. Still, her mother often accompanied her on paper routes, and her father, a police officer, encouraged people to be vigilant. On Monday, March 26, 1984, Cherry's mother stayed home to prepare a special dinner and couldn't accompany her. Cherry came home after school and left to deliver papers around 3:30 p.m., promising to return in about an hour so she could call a friend. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Her mother later carried lifelong guilt for letting her go alone that day. At 4:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was a neighbor boy, a friend of Cherry's, asking to speak with her. Realizing that Cherry hadn't returned as promised, and knowing how punctual she always was, her mother grew concerned. She tried to stay calm, thinking that Cherry might have lost track of time while talking to someone, but she informed her husband. He immediately notified fellow officers to be vigilant and report anything unusual. Following his instructions, Cherry's mother began calling her daughter's friends and relatives. They checked with Cherry's aunt, to whom she was very close, but she hadn't seen her. An hour passed with no news. No one knows where Cherry is, and her parents are very worried. No one had seen Cherry since she left on her regular paper route. Her father and other officers couldn't wait any longer. They began searching the area, focusing on the 2 streets where she usually walked. They also spoke with people along the route, including Cherry's friends. Her best friend reported that they had seen each other from across the street earlier that day and exchanged a quick wave. Cherry stayed focused on her deliveries and didn't stop to chat. This sighting helped investigators narrow down the timeline of her disappearance. The last time anyone saw Cherry was around 4:00 p.m. She was alone, and witnesses noticed nothing unusual. Some people assumed she had gone to visit friends and would return soon. Her parent disagreed. She was a homebody, never went out without permission, and all her belongings were still in her room. By 7:00 p.m., her father, himself a police officer, and other officers had interviewed most residents on the 2 streets where Cherry usually delivered newspapers. They found nothing useful. That evening, the police department alerted the entire city, bringing more officers into the search. By the next morning, firefighters, county and state police, Kminusnina units, and a police helicopter joined in. The search area expanded into the outskirts, but no trace of Cherry was found. Her father was one of the most active searchers. He frequently called home, hoping Cherry had returned, and it was all a misunderstanding. Each time, his wife tearfully told him there was no news, until she remembered something important. She recalled that during her paper route, Cherry was afraid of a house 7 blocks away. A man there always stared at her in a way that gave her goosebumps. Cherry mentioned it to her mother repeatedly. Her father took this lead seriously. Police went to the house, but no one answered the door, and it seemed empty. Without cause to force entry, they had to leave. He kept the address in mind. About 30 hours of unsuccessful searching passed. With no new information, police held a press conference to draw public attention. Several tips came in, but all were dead ends. Soon after, the previously absent resident of that house appeared. Detectives went to see him. He is James Wales, 35 years old. He lives a quiet, normal life and rarely attracts attention. He remembered Cherry, who had delivered his papers, but said he hadn't seen her in days and didn't know where she was. There was no basis to arrest him, but detectives found him unsettling and took interest. With no other leads, they began to focus on him. News of the suspicious resident spread. A local journalist visited James, who let him in and answered questions about Cherry, though he seemed reluctant and quickly grew nervous. The journalist reported his concerns to police on March 27, 1984. Cherry's father ran a records check on James. He had no serious criminal history, only prior incidents of drunk driving and trespassing. The trespassing occurred years earlier when, drunk after leaving a bar, he wandered into a field a few kilometers from home. No one was harmed, and he received a warning. A deeper look revealed something more troubling. Years before Cherry went missing, James lived in Normandy, New York. The files show that the parents of a boy once filed a complaint alleging that James committed abuse. The case was transferred to social services and then closed without law enforcement action. He was never charged. These findings increased suspicion that he might be involved in Cherry's disappearance. Detectives met with him again. They noted he was unusually nervous, dodged direct questions, and avoided eye contact, especially when asked about Cherry, further heightening their concern. Despite James denying he saw Cherry on the day she disappeared, detectives brought him to the station for formal questioning. There, detectives found James uncomfortable communicating, unwilling to cooperate, and almost immediately requested a lawyer. While James was being questioned, his wife also spoke to the police. Convinced that her husband had nothing to do with Cherry's disappearance, she agreed to have her home searched. Investigators soon found a paper bag matching the one Cherry used for her newspapers and Cherry's earrings in a dresser drawer. 2 hours later, the search continued. A detective went down to the basement and discovered what looked like dried blood. In the back of the room, they found a blanket wrapped around a girl's body. It was 12 years old, Cherry Lindsay. She was dead. Meanwhile, at the station, James continued to deny any involvement. James admitted he knew Cherry. Like other neighbors, he received newspapers from her and described her as very punctual. He offered nothing else. When informed about the discovery in his home, he stopped cooperating. Detectives believed his resistance wouldn't last. About 90 minutes later, James confessed. He said Cherry had delivered the newspaper and he lured her inside. She screamed immediately. He tried to silence her by covering her mouth, but she fought back and he began strangling her. As Cherry struggled harder, he grew enraged, grabbed a table leg, and struck her head several times. She lost consciousness, but was still alive. He tied her hands behind her back, stuffed her t-shirt in her mouth, opened the basement door, and threw her down the stairs. Cherry sustained more injuries in the fall. James followed her downstairs, wrapped a clothesline around her neck, and continued strangling her for several minutes. When she showed no signs of life, he abused her without removing the rope. He claimed he had not intended to kill her and blamed the attack on uncontrollable, impulsive violence. He then returned to his routine, finished cooking dinner, and went back to the basement. About 15 minutes later, unsure if Cherry was dead, he used the rope still around her neck to make certain he hung her from a sewer pipe for about half an hour. Afterward, he wrapped her body, clothes, and some belongings in a blanket, collected her newspapers and the money she had earned that day, showered, changed, and removed the clothes he had worn during the crime. He went to the basement several more times to check if she was dead. His calm, detached description of these actions suggested a complete lack of remorse. Ironically, 35 years old, James was the same man who had helped Cherry with her paper route. Though Cherry had found him creepy and strange and was wary of him, he had shown her the route for delivering newspapers. Investigators now suspect this was part of a plan to gain her trust and lure her to her death. To understand how he came to commit such a crime, police examined his background. They quickly learned James's life was marked by violence. His father died when he was young. His stepfather was abusive and drank heavily. His mother, also an alcoholic, joined in punishing him rather than protecting him. James started drinking in school and later used illegal substances. James was a troubled teenager who repeatedly tried to flee his abusive parents. Despite multiple reports of domestic violence, law enforcement took no action. At 17, he finally escaped from his mother and stepfather and enlisted in the United States of America Army. He served for 6 years and earned honors and awards. He returned to Norway in 1972 and married 3 times. His last wife was Sue Ellen. They had 2 children and, for a time, lived a normal life. After leaving the army, he worked at International Business Machines, but lost his job in 1983 due to long-standing alcohol and banned substance abuse. After being fired, his mental health deteriorated. His wife tried to support him, but they never sought professional help. He displayed paranoia and delusions, yet no official diagnosis was made, and he received no treatment. According to his wife and witnesses, he was a ticking time bomb, warnings that went unheeded until it was too late. Investigators later discovered that James had an unexpected accomplice. He had not forced Cherry into his house. She went there willingly. However, her family insisted that she would never have gone with such a suspicious man of her own accord. James had used his 11-year-old stepson, Brian. Knowing approximately when Cherry delivered newspapers, James watched for a moment when she was alone. When he saw her without her mother, he told Brian to help. Brian, who knew Cherry, invited her inside. During police questioning, Brian admitted that James had ordered him to do this. As soon as Cherry entered, James appeared and told Brian to leave. The boy ran to his upstairs room. He feared something terrible would happen, but stayed silent out of fear. After James confessed to the murder, police returned to the house to gather corroborating evidence in case he later recanted. Inside, they found Cherry's newspapers and the money she had collected, both stolen by James. Blood on the basement floor and wall indicated she had been beaten and thrown down the stairs. They recovered a blood-stained sewer pipe used to hang her, along with pieces of clothesline and fragments of her clothing. Evidence also showed the murder was premeditated. Before Cherry began her paper route, James did not subscribe to that newspaper. He subscribed only after she started working. Witnesses said he fixated on her, even following and observing her route. Based on this evidence, on April 6, 1984, James Wales was charged with second-degree murder, abuse, kidnapping, burglary, and abuse of a corpse. He was arrested held in the county jail, and denied bail as a particularly dangerous offender. Unable to afford an attorney, he was assigned a public defender. The defense first sought his release on bail and requested a change of venue due to extensive local publicity that could compromise an impartial jury. Both requests were denied. The defense then filed an insanity plea. In 1984, the state governor signed a bill revising the standard for insanity defenses, shifting the burden to showing the defendant did not understand right from wrong. The attorney believed this was James's only chance to avoid a life sentence. The trial, initially set for July 30, 1984, was postponed multiple times at the defense's request. The trial finally began on October 18, 1984. The prosecutor presented detailed evidence: the rope used to strangle Cherry, a table leg with her blood, and James's confession, which he later tried to retract by claiming insanity. The evidence also included the newspapers and money he took after the murder. During the hearing, a defense psychiatrist testified that he believed James was insane, diagnosing him with intermittent explosive disorder, a relatively common condition marked by unpredictable anger and violent outbursts. At the time, about 200,000 people in the United States had been diagnosed with this disorder. According to the expert, James could not resist his impulses to do harm. The psychiatrist said that during multiple meetings with James in jail, he observed a range of disturbing symptoms. In one session, James claimed that during the murder, he believed he was attacking his mother, not Cherry. He blamed his mother for his abusive childhood, hated her, and wanted revenge. The psychiatrist concluded that James was unable to consider the consequences of his actions or control himself at the time of the crime. Two of James's ex-wives also testified. They said he had a tendency toward violence that could take disturbing forms. For example, James likes to strangle during intimacy and has a hard time stopping. The court then heard a detailed account of the murder and the horrors Cherry endured. Cherry's parents struggled to listen. The medical examiner testified that it took about 30 minutes for her to die from strangulation. Based on James's own timeline, even when he hung Cherry in the basement, she may still have been alive. Brian also testified against James. These events were deeply traumatic for 11-year-old Brian. He said he heard screams and muffled thuds. Cherry cried for help, and then it went quiet. Brian was too scared to leave the room because he knew how cruel James could be. He feared he would be attacked next. After 11 days of trial, the jury began deliberations. Notably, the jury did not see all the evidence investigators gathered. The judge excluded crime scene photos of Cherry, her torn clothing, and the marks left on her body, believing such shocking images might prevent the jury from remaining impartial. After 3 hours and 15 minutes, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The insanity defense failed. On November 12 of that year, James Wales was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years, the maximum allowed by state law. In his final statement, he said he was sorry, but it sounded unconvincing. As throughout the trial, James remained impassive and showed no emotion. When issuing the sentence, the judge, citing the brutality of the crime, urged the state never to grant James parole. However, James qualified for the first time in 2017. Cherry's parents could not accept this loss. They moved out of the family home and eventually put it up for sale. By then, the house had a grim reputation. Many believed Cherry's spirit was unsettled and that strange events occurred there. The house became known as haunted. Twice, new residents abandoned it, and neighbors reported moving objects, voix, and unexplained sounds. On July 30, 2020, the ghost house was demolished. At that moment, Cherry's mother also discarded her daughter's newspaper bag, deciding it was finally time to let her go. Cherry's father, however, believed her spirit would only be at peace once the killer died behind bars. The city council honored Cherry's memory in 1984 by naming a local park after her and installing a small memorial there. James was first granted parole on April 12, 2017. Like any American inmate, he could appear before a parole board, and he exercised that right. His hearings were met with public protests organized by Cherry's parents. James told the board he struggled with stress, had a difficult childhood due to his abusive grandfather, and believed he would never have killed Cherry if not for a mental health crisis. Despite his statements, the parole board denied his release. Cherry's parents continued to hold public demonstrations, calling for him to remain imprisoned for life. Ahead of each new hearing, they intensified their efforts to seek justice for their daughter. 3 years later, James became eligible for parole again. A supporter of Cherry and her family launched an online petition that gathered more than 9,000 signatures. In total, 409 pages of signatures and 120 pages of comments were submitted to the board. James was denied parole a second time. And again, in 2023, law enforcement maintained that he should remain behind bars for life. Another hearing was scheduled for 2025. Throughout this period, Cherry's family appealed to the public, doing everything they could to prevent his release. On February 28, 2023, Cherry's father died at age 81 after a brief battle with liver cancer. Before his death, he asked that James never be released. In 2025, James was denied parole again. The next hearing is scheduled for 2 years later. Cherry's mother and others fear that in 2027, the board may consider releasing James, in part because of the terminal illness he has suffered from for years. Although the family's leading advocate, Cherry's father, has passed away, his cause continues online and in person. Many supporters, including Cherry's mother, remain determined to ensure that James is never released from prison. On a quiet spring night in 2015, the town of Somerville, South Carolina, was shaken by a disappearance that would soon unravel into one of its darkest tragedies. Ashley Pegram, a 28-year-old single mother of 3, disappeared after meeting a stranger online. This is not just the story of Ashley's final hours, it is a story of betrayal, of a family's desperate search for truth. It was spring 2015 in the quiet town of Somerville, near Charleston. Ashley, a hard-working single mom raising 3 young children, had connected with someone on the app Meet Me. They had also been messaging on Kik for about a month before deciding to meet in person. On the evening of the 3rd of April, 2015, around 9:30 p.m., Edward picked her up from her home in a Hyundai Sonata. The next morning, Ashley's family received a message claiming she had been dropped off at a gas station because she was too drunk. But that story didn't make sense. Ashley wasn't the type to disappear without checking in, especially with her kids waiting at home. Panicked, her family immediately reported her missing, leading to a community search and an urgent police investigation. To truly understand why Ashley's disappearance struck such a deep chord, we need to look at the woman behind the headlines. Ashley Pegram grew up in Somerville, South Carolina, in a close-knit family that valued togetherness. She shared a modest home with her mother and sister, Randy Chance, sometimes even sharing one phone for the whole household. At just 28 years old, Ashley was already a devoted mother of 3. Friends and family described her as a loving, playful parent, the kind of mum who turned chores into games and always put her kids first. But life hadn't been easy. Years earlier, the father of her sons had passed away, leaving her to grapple with grief. At times, she leaned on alcohol to cope with the pain, though her mother made sure those struggles never touched the children. That April evening, Ashley told her family she was heading out for a casual night, just a drink or two. She wore jeans, a grey sweater, and new shoes, keeping it simple. When Edward Bonilla, 30, the man she had been talking to, arrived in his Sonata, he didn't come to the door or introduce himself. He just waited in the car, which struck her family as odd. Still, Ashley got in, and the two drove off. They ended up at a bonfire hosted by Edward's brother. It was a casual gathering. People around a fire, others playing ping pong in the garage. Ashley seemed relaxed, chatting with people she'd never met before. One attendee later recalled that Ashley was friendly and easy to talk to. She had a couple of beers from the six-pack she'd brought, but showed no signs of intoxication. She was steady, engaged, and in control. By about 11:45 p.m., Edward decided it was time to leave. Ashley wasn't in a hurry. She still had beer left and seemed to want to stay, but he took the rest of her six-pack and ushered her out. Just after midnight on April 5th, they pulled into a gas station on College Park Road. Security cameras captured Ashley going inside at 12:04 a.m., using the restroom, and leaving at 12:11 a.m. She appeared fine, calm, and composed. She got back into the Sonata, and the two drove off together. After that, according to Edward's later account, things got heated in the car. He said Ashley started yelling, accusing him of stealing her mum's phone. Even though she hadn't taken the family phone with her that night, he claimed she became so upset that she wandered out near a mobile home park, which was only about 1.5 miles from her house. He said he let her out there to use the bathroom again and then drove off after the argument, assuming she would walk home. But as the hours passed and Ashley never returned, it became clear something far more sinister had happened that night. Ashley's house was silent that night. Her usual, "Mom, I'm home," never came. At 3:29 a.m., Edward sent a kick message to the family phone, saying he hoped Ashley was okay. He claimed he left her at a gas station because she was too drunk. However, this didn't match what others saw at the bonfire, where Ashley didn't seem very intoxicated. By morning on the 4th of April, the silence became unbearable. Ashley's mother noticed she hadn't returned, so she checked the phone and saw Edward's message. Her sister, Brandy, immediately began calling his number over and over. When Edward finally called back, his story shifted. Now he claimed he'd dropped Ashley near a mobile home park. That sudden change sent alarm bells ringing. Brandy and her mother rushed out, walking the dark roadside near the park, peering into ditches, terrified she might have fallen or been struck by a car. They found nothing. Still, Brandy couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her chest. As hours passed with no sign of Ashley, panic grew. The family reached out to friends, spreading word of her disappearance. Everyone knew Ashley would never abandon her children. By that evening, her mother called dispatch to file a missing persons report. She laid out the details of the date, the late-night messages, and just how out of character this was. With those early red flags, the Dorchester County Sheriff's Office quickly took action. Detective Sergeant Martin was assigned on the 7th of April, just days after Ashley was last seen. He started where most cases begin, with the people closest to her. Brandy recounted everything: the shared family phone Ashley had left behind, the 3:29 a.m. kick message, and Edward's inconsistent stories. Martin quickly saw that this wasn't a case of someone walking away from their life. Ashley had no history of disappearing. She was a devoted mother, with no enemies, no bitter disputes. Her world revolved around her kids. Friends and neighbors echoed the same picture. Ashley was lively, photogenic, the kind of person who lit up family gatherings. No one recalled seeing strange cars beyond Edward's Sonata that night, nor hearing arguments near the house. Still, some hinted at her vulnerability, saying grief sometimes led her into impulsive choices. One friend remembered Ashley was depressed, making poor decisions and things like that because of it. Neighbors joined the family in combing ditches and wooded lots, but the searches came up empty. Police pushed flyers, took in tips, and monitored social media, but no breakthrough came. Then came Edward. On the 8th of April, at 6:00 p.m., he walked into the sheriff's office for an interview. At first, he seemed cooperative. He outlined his story, picking Ashley up, going to the bonfire, hair drinking, the stop at the gas station, the argument about a stolen phone, and finally dropping her near the mobile home park. He even pointed to a scuff mark on his car's front right quarter panel, claiming Ashley had kicked it in anger. But Martin's eyes caught a detail Edward didn't expect. The mark wasn't shaped like a normal kick. It was narrow at the bottom and wider at the top, exactly the kind of impression you'd see if someone had been on their back, kicking upward. Edward also slipped in small lies, like claiming he was unemployed due to an ankle injury, that raised even more suspicion. Investigators moved fast to test his story. They pulled security footage from the gas station on College Park Road. The video confirmed the timeline: the Sonata pulling in at 12:04 a.m., Ashley stepping out, calm and steady, using the restroom and getting back into the car at 12:11 p.m. She wasn't stumbling. She wasn't distressed. The footage shattered Edward's claim that she was too drunk to stand. Then, investigators turned their attention to the mobile home park. Edward swore he'd dropped Ashley there, but nearby surveillance told a different story. A garage at the intersection had cameras pointed directly at the road. When detectives reviewed the tapes, no Hyundai Sonata appeared during the time frame Edward described. His alibi collapsed on the spot. Why insist he'd been there if the cameras proved otherwise? Detectives circled back to the bonfire, re-interviewing attendees. Edward's brother's girlfriend, who had known the family for years, gave a clear impression. Ashley arrived around 9:30 p.m. Friendly, steady, and in no way stumbling drunk. In fact, Ashley wanted to stay longer, but Edward abruptly ended the night, even scooping up the beers she'd brought. Other guests echoed the same. Ashley was relaxed, social, enjoying herself. No aggression. This painted a starkly different picture from Edward's story of a drunk, unruly woman. Then came a breakthrough from an unexpected source. A tip from Edward's ex-girlfriend revealed he wasn't unemployed at all. He worked at cobble flooring and had access to company vans. When Detective Martin confronted him at the job site, Edward fumbled, claiming he had just started a few days ago. His boss quickly corrected him, saying Edward has been working there for 8 months. The lie raised even more questions. Why conceal his work? What was he hiding about those vans? Investigators acted fast. Edward's boss mentioned that he had seen Edward heading to the company van as if to retrieve something. Martin moved quickly, securing the Ford Econoline before Edward could touch it. Inside, the site was chilling. Red stains streaked the walls, ceiling, and scattered items. A dented polyurethane missing its handle, tested positive for blood. Detectives collected Ashley's DNA standards, a toothbrush, a hairbrush, and sent everything to the lab. Within days, results came back. The blood in the van was Ashley's. The spatter patterns suggested something far worse, that she had suffered repetitive force while still alive. Attention then shifted to the sonata. With Edward's mother's cooperation, investigators located it in North Charleston and seized it for processing. No obvious blood was found, but the suspicious shoe print on the car's panel was preserved. Step by step, Edward's carefully spun story was unraveling. Digital forensics made the noose even tighter. Cell phone records showed Edward's device pinging towers far from his normal routes. On the 4th of April, between 6:44 a.m. and 7:12 a.m. His phone was in Harleyville. Hours later, pings placed him back near work. What was he doing there? Search efforts widened. Authorities scoured reservoirs near Edward's apartment complex, even calling in the Department of Natural Resources to help scan the alligator-infested waters by boat and air. But no trace of Ashley surfaced. Still, investigators knew the case was building. By mid-April, the evidence was overwhelming: blood in the van, phone pings pointing to suspicious travel, witnesses contradicting Edward's story, and his lies about even the simplest details. On the 15th of April, 2015, detectives decided enough was enough. They moved to arrest Edward Bonilla for obstruction of justice, citing his repeated deceptions. When officers arrived at his apartment complex, the scene only deepened their suspicions. Edward was dragging a suitcase toward a rental SUV, seemingly preparing to vanish. The timing was telling. He was taken into custody without resistance. What began as a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation, with Edward squarely in the spotlight. To understand Edward Bonilla, investigators dug into his background. Born and raised in Dorchester County, he attended local schools, where classmates remembered him as someone who blended in with the crowd. He had a brother, Anthony, and the family often gathered for casual get-togethers, like the bonfire Ashley attended that night. Outwardly, Edward seemed ordinary, with a steady job and a long-term girlfriend, but text records revealed another side. While making plans with his partner about dinner and intimacy, he was also messaging Ashley. It painted the picture of a man leading a double life, showing little concern for loyalty or honesty. Professionally, Edward had worked at Cobble Flooring for 8 months, installing flooring and driving company vans. His criminal record was minimal. No serious charges that might have raised alarms, but people who knew him later described a pattern of disregard toward women. When first questioned after his arrest, Edward stuck to the story he'd told before. He repeated the detail about her supposedly accusing him of stealing her mother's phone and kicking his car in anger. But detectives pressed him about the inconsistencies, particularly the surveillance footage showing no Sonata near the mobile home park. As the weeks passed and evidence like Ashley's blood in the van was presented, his answers grew evasive. Though he never confessed outright during interrogations, the walls were closing in. By early May, the case took a decisive turn. On May 5, 2015, based on the forensic results and the mounting circumstantial evidence, Edward Bonilla's charges were upgraded to murder. Investigators didn't believe the crime was premeditated. Instead, they theorized it stemmed from a confrontation that escalated into violence. His pattern of disrespect toward women, combined with Ashley's resistance that night, suggested the encounter spiraled out of control. Just 3 days later, on May 8, 2015, during a private consultation with his attorney, Edward finally broke. He revealed the location of Ashley's body, a remote, wooded tract off Brown Road near Harleyville, the same area where his phone had pinged weeks earlier. Authorities launched a search immediately. On May 9, 2015, search teams, including volunteers and dogs, scoured the site. Deep in the woods, far from any main road, they discovered Ashley's remains. She had been there for more than 5 weeks, lying face down in the mud. Her body was naked except for a red bra, partly wrapped around her neck. Nearby lay a black garment. Her eyeglasses, later matched to family photos, confirmed her identity. Black electrical tape was still looped around her right wrist and neck. Clear evidence of restraint. The autopsy ruled her death a homicide by violence. Discolorations on her scalp were consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Even after the discovery, Edward's story shifted only slightly. He suggested that restraint during the altercation had gone wrong, but he stopped short of taking full responsibility. By then, however, the evidence spoke louder than his words. The investigation had moved into its next phase, preparing for trial. The trial began on August 8, 2016, in Dorchester County and lasted 4 days. The prosecution argued that Edward intentionally killed Ashley, presenting a timeline of lies and physical proof. They showed gas station surveillance footage of Ashley appearing sober, which contradicted Edward's claim that she was extremely drunk. Phone records and cell tower data showed Edward was in remote locations like Harleyville soon after Ashley disappeared. Near where her body was eventually discovered, experts testified that bloodstains on Edward's work truck showed repeated blunt force trauma, consistent with autopsy results. The prosecution also pointed out that Ashley had a muscle relaxant called cyclohexanone in her system, which she had no reason to take, suggesting she was drugged without her knowledge. Furthermore, the prosecution emphasized that Edward's story changed multiple times, including where he claimed to have left Ashley. They also highlighted his lies about his job and his attempt to escape before being arrested. The prosecution concluded that his actions were not accidental, but a deliberate cover-up of a crime. The defense argued that Ashley's death was a tragic accident caused by a misunderstanding. Edward testified that Ashley became angry after they stopped at a gas station, accusing him of stealing and getting out of the car. He said he accidentally ran her over while backing up. Then, to stop her from attacking him, he held her in what he described as a bear hug, possibly a chokehold. He didn't realize she had stopped breathing until it was too late. Edward admitted he panicked. He put Ashley in the trunk of the Sonata temporarily, then left her on a frontage road. Later, he used his work van to move her body and bury her in a shallow grave. Using a board as a shovel, the defense pointed out that Edward had no serious criminal record. They suggested that the blood evidence was consistent with an accidental struggle, not a deliberate murder. They asked the jury to consider lesser charges, such as involuntary manslaughter, arguing that it was a brief loss of control without any intention to kill Ashley. After deliberating, a jury found Edward Bonilla guilty of murder on August 11, 2016. The judge described the handling and disposal of the body as particularly cruel and sentenced Edward to life in prison without parole. He appealed the conviction in 2019, arguing issues with evidence, admission, and trial conduct, but the South Carolina Court of Appeals upheld the decision, affirming the life sentence. Betrayal doesn't always come with raised voices or broken vows. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as love and care, a glass of water, a vitamin handed at bedtime, a calm voice saying everything will be fine. For Hannah, that betrayal came from the one person she trusted most, her husband. As Hannah weakened day by day, Brian was more than her caretaker. He was the source of her suffering. Behind his polished image as a chiropractor and devoted father, he had set up a financial plan not for their future, But for the time after her death, he'd taken out multiple life insurance policies totaling over $1 million, all listing him as the sole beneficiary. What looked like devotion was, in truth, calculation. What seemed like protection was exploitation. And in the end, the man who vowed to cherish his wife in sickness and in health used her sickness as the path to his own fortune. This is the story of a marriage that became a contract of death, where love was poisoned for profit. Hannah lived in Decatur, Alabama, in a home organized entirely around her children's routines. Her days revolved around early wake-ups, daycare drop-offs, meals, naps, and evening activities. She manages the household and works part-time as a skincare specialist, sometimes seeing clients at home, sometimes at a guest house. She did not pursue a steady full-time career. Her husband, Brian Mann, was the family's financial breadwinner, allowing her to focus on housework and raising the children. They married in 2018. By the time of these events, Hannah was in her early 20s. Brian, her husband, was a local chiropractor who ran his own practice. Brian's clinic had a reputation for order and professionalism, friendly receptionists, spotless rooms, and strict scheduling. Patients praised his attentive consultations, personalized treatment plans, and reliable follow-up for chronic conditions. His strong reputation brought steady referrals, and the community trusted him. Brian's family lived simply but comfortably. Supported by the clinic's income, big expenses were planned in advance. But when it came to the children, they didn't hesitate to spend. Neighbors saw a neat house, a well-kept yard, weekend outings, all painted a picture of a perfect life. Successful husband, good wife, 2 young children, a peaceful lifestyle, but inside, things were more rigid than they seemed. Brian controlled many domestic decisions and gradually isolated Hannah from others. After the wedding, her meetups with friends dwindled. Appointments were often postponed or cancelled because of inconvenience, bad timing, or no one to look after the kids. She left social media and was eventually locked out of her accounts. Brian said it was for privacy and safety. He kept access to their shared email and passwords. He handled nearly all household administration, subscriptions, bills, appointments. While Hannah's days were consumed by home tasks, mornings were for getting everyone else ready. Afternoons went to errands, cooking, and laundry. Evenings followed the children's schedules. She rarely visited the clinic, and only when necessary. Brian told others, and likely himself, that everything was under control. He cited his medical background at home too, advice on sleep, vitamins, and nutrition. Appearing deeply involved in family life, that's how it looked. A well-ordered life, growing control within the household, and the slow erasure of Hannah's personal space. In mid-2021, a change came that seemed harmless at first. Leveraging his role as a health professional, Brian suggested Hannah start a daily vitamin regimen tailored to support her as a busy mother with little time to rest. He said the supplements came from his clinic, ensuring quality and safety. They were chewable gummies and powdered drinks. Trusting his advice, Hannah accepted it as a routine wellness step. Soon it was habit. Each evening, Brian brought the supplements to the bedroom with a glass of water. If she forgot, he gently reminded her, stressing consistency and promising benefits with regular use. His persistence looked like care. A few weeks later, Hannah began to notice slight changes in her body. Fatigue, dizziness. She attributed it to the workload of housework and childcare. Gradually, the symptoms became more severe. Back pain, frequent stomach pain. Her diet hadn't changed, yet she was losing weight. By the end of summer, her clothes hung loosely. Even though she hadn't tried to slim down, Brian stayed calm. As Hannah's symptoms emerged. He told her that her body was adjusting to improved nutrition, that any side effects were temporary, and that she would feel stronger within a few months. He spoke with absolute confidence, drawing on his medical background. Hannah wasn't alarmed. Her symptoms developed slowly, without any sudden crisis. Occasional good days made her think she might be recovering. Even as her energy declined and her weight continued to drop, it was this period that laid the foundation for a health condition that quickly became serious and dangerous. By late summer 2021, Hannah's condition had worsened significantly. Nausea set in, making it difficult to eat regularly. From September 2021 to January 2022, she lost nearly 40 pounds, dropping to about 84 pounds. Even doing daily housework left her breathless and exhausted. Standing in the kitchen for long was hard. She felt dizzy and had lower back pain. Stairs exhausted her. Eventually, she struggled to stay balanced and began using a rolling office chair to move around the house to reduce strain and avoid falls. Nighttime muscle cramps increased, and her sleep became shallow and restless. Despite Hannah's obvious decline in health, Brian discouraged her from seeking medical attention. He insisted he could manage her routine himself and framed her symptoms as the stress of parenting, seasonal fatigue, and lack of sleep, saying they didn't require professional attention. At the same time, Brian tightened control over the household. He decided when Hannah should rest, reminded her to take the supplements he provided, and personally brought her water to keep her on his schedule. He recommended at-home remedies, more rest, hydration, and light stretches, demonstrating them as safe and effective. He stayed soft-spoken and attentive, projecting care. By late fall, fatigue overshadowed everything else. Lifting her son and daughter became difficult. Hannah often asked them to wait while she sat to catch her breath. She had to spread out chores. Simple tasks took hours. By December, the contrast between how she looked and how she felt was clear. Her clothes hung loose and her face looked sunken. Yet her temperature was normal. Adding to the confusion, she knew she was getting worse but couldn't understand why. Her diet and workload hadn't changed. By early January 2022, Hannah was in crisis. Standing caused sudden weakness and brief vision blurring. Eating was a struggle. Food sometimes repulsed her, and a few bites could trigger nausea. Moving around without support became dangerous. She relied on the rolling chair to get from room to room. Still, Brian remained steadfast. He kept saying, "The worst is over," insisting she just needed more time to recover. He stayed calm, managed details, issued reminders, and spoke with unwavering confidence. When Hannah's condition became life-threatening, she did not seek help on her own. Her mother, visiting occasionally, recognized the danger and decided to act without telling Brian. Hannah could barely walk, so her mother helped her dress and guided her to the car. On the way to the hospital, Hannah said little, mostly describing abdominal pain and extreme weakness. At the University of Alabama Hospital emergency room, her mother immediately told staff that her condition had been deteriorating for months without medical care. Doctors began by checking the basics: weight, blood pressure, temperature, and heart rate. The results were alarming. Hannah's weight was dangerously low. Her pulse was weak, and her blood pressure was unstable. Physicians initially considered a broad range of causes, from chronic conditions to serious systemic illnesses, and ordered extensive lab tests and diagnostic procedures. Blood work revealed a critical finding. Hannah's blood lead level was about 80 micrograms per deciliter. For comparison, anything above 10 is medically concerning. Her level posed an immediate, life-threatening risk. Additional tests showed signs of internal organ distress, and she soon developed acute respiratory failure, Doctors placed her on a ventilator to support her breathing. Imaging scans revealed fine, metallic-like particles throughout her tissues. Lead deposits accumulated over time from ongoing exposure rather than a single event. This chronic exposure explained her gradual symptoms and the sudden crisis. Once her condition became critical, her health declined so quickly that doctors induced a medical coma to reduce physiological stress and prevent permanent damage. Treatment began immediately with chelation therapy to bind and remove the lead. Progress was slow and required continuous monitoring. Hannah remained hospitalized for nearly 2 months. During that time, the team stabilized her breathing, improved her vital signs, and lowered her blood lead levels. Still, the damage from prolonged exposure was evident, and full recovery was unlikely. Doctors emphasized that even a 1-day delay might have been fatal. Hannah's survival ultimately hinged on her mother's decision to act, breaking from the family's usual pattern and enabling a timely diagnosis and urgent treatment. Once the diagnosis was confirmed, the hospital notified the Morgan County Department of Human Resources, which then alerted state investigators in Alabama. Specialists in toxic metal exposure took the case. Their first step was to test Hannah's family home for environmental sources of lead. They began in the kitchen and bathrooms, collecting water samples from every faucet and removing filters for analysis. They documented the condition of the plumbing and dishware used for food and drinks. Investigators also collected paint chips from older surfaces, dust samples, and soil from outside. They reviewed pantry items, including foods and nutritional products given to the children. Brian cooperated, pointing out the vitamin supplements Hannah had been taking from his clinic. He also suggested fast food as a possible source of exposure. Investigators documented his comments, but quickly ruled out that theory. With a blood lead level near 80 micrograms per deciliter, other cases would likely have appeared, yet no similar local incidents were reported. Furthermore, Brian and their other children showed no signs of lead exposure, undermining the idea of common environmental source. Initial lab tests of the home's water, paint, dust, pantry items, and nutritional products showed no hazardous lead levels or notable abnormalities. At this point, investigators had found no typical household source of contamination. They recommended testing for all household members. Brian reported that his son and daughter's results were normal and said he would complete his own testing later at a separate facility. His delay raised concerns, especially since some tests could have been done immediately on site. This was flagged for follow-up. A second home inspection occurred a few days later, with experts from the Alabama Department of Public Health expanding the scope of testing. They collected water from initial flow and post-flush samples, gathered dust from multiple surfaces, inspected filters, and took swabs from the kitchen's sink, kettle, and blender to check for metal leaching. Investigators also requested packaging from the vitamins and powder mixes to identify the manufacturer and batch numbers. The second round of results reinforced the initial findings. There was no source of lead in the home environment. However, the source and composition of Hannah's supplements remained unclear because the investigators did not have access to actual samples. They began to reconstruct Hannah's daily routine by talking to her family and close contacts. They focused on who prepared the meals, and especially the timing, location, frequency, and context in which Hannah took the supplements. The family reported that Brian regularly reminded Hannah to take them in the evening. At home, with a glass of water he left by her bed. These details supported a working theory of intentional oral exposure. The initial stages of the investigation revealed 3 main findings. There was no evidence of lead contamination in the home environment. The hypothesis of exposure through eating at restaurants was not supported by any definitive data. Further consideration of factors related to dietary supplement use, particularly Brian's direct role, warranted further scrutiny. As a result, investigators shifted their attention to Brian, verifying his statements and checking whether he had access to lead outside the home. After Hannah was hospitalized, Brian arrived at the hospital claiming he had performed a self-exam. He said he used X-ray equipment at his own clinic and believed he saw a foreign substance in his body that could be lead. This claim puzzled the medical team. Self-diagnosing with X-rays is highly unorthodox, and using clinic equipment for personal testing is not standard practice. Physicians insisted he undergo a full, independent evaluation. When Brian realized the hospital would conduct the tests, he became visibly anxious. Screening confirmed the presence of lead in his system, but only at a low level, consistent with very recent exposure, too low to cause symptoms and not indicative of long-term accumulation. This is in stark contrast to Hannah's results, which showed clear evidence of prolonged exposure at high levels over several months. Experts concluded that Brian had likely ingested lead shortly before coming to the hospital to present himself as a fellow victim. This may have been an attempt to appear proactive and concerned, but the exposure timeline did not match and undermined his story. Interviews with colleagues and acquaintances further showed that Brian exhibited no symptoms of chronic lead exposure throughout Hannah's illness. His behavior and physical condition remained normal. To investigators, this strongly suggested Hannah's poisoning was not accidental. The pattern pointed to deliberate poisoning with no apparent risk to other family members. Brian's attempt to cast himself as a victim only deepened suspicion. Authorities believed he was trying to divert attention from the central issue, how lead had been entering Hannah's body over an extended period. In summer 2022, a contractor who had worked for Brian the previous year contacted investigators. He reported that in 2021, he had installed an X-ray room at Brian's clinic, lining the walls with lead sheets. After completion, leftover lead sheets and scraps remained. According to the contractor, Brian asked that the unused pieces be left behind, saying he would handle them. At the time, this seemed routine. Brian owned the clinic and had paid for the materials, but after learning of Hannah's diagnosis, the contractor reconsidered. He gave an official statement to police. Investigators compared his account with Hannah's medical timeline and found a match. Her symptoms worsened markedly in August 2021. Shortly after the clinic renovation was completed, the dates aligned. Brian gained access to lead just before Hannah's prolonged illness began. This gave investigators a documented external source of the toxic metal separate from the family's home. The contractor on the clinic project provided a detailed timeline from start to final cleanup. He explained standard procedures. Leftover materials are either returned to the warehouse or disposed of safely. He did not see what Brian did with the remaining lead. He simply handed it to him at the clinic owner's request. Investigators obtained the service agreement, start and completion dates, and a full materials list, confirming both the timing and presence of lead-based shielding. Clinic staff reported that only Brian had keys to the X-ray room and that the post-installation cleanup occurred without the contractor. This timeline became central. In 2021, Brian had access to a real source of lead. While the contractor's statement did not explain how the lead was administered, it established where it came from and supported the theory of intentional exposure. As the investigation progressed, another key detail emerged. Hannah had multiple life insurance policies totaling about $3 million. All policies named Brian as policyholder and sole beneficiary. Because they were spread across several insurers, they were harder to detect and obscured the overall coverage. The first policy was taken out in 2020, and Hannah likely knew about it. In 2021, around the time her health declined, additional policies were added. Attempts to increase coverage by another $5 million were denied when applications were rejected. The timing of these expansions, coinciding with Hannah's worsening condition, strengthened the case for intent. The health questionnaires required for approval were especially important. They demanded proof of good health, and significant weight loss could trigger denial. According to Hannah, Brian pressured her to wear weighted ankle bands during weigh-ins to conceal her weight loss and make her appear stable, benefiting the applications. During medical consultations, Brian seemed more focused on policy limits and conditions than on diagnosis or treatment. Staff noted he repeatedly raised insurance technicalities as a priority. Hannah's insurance forms carried electronic signatures, which later became disputed. The defense claimed Hannah was aware and involved. She denied this, saying Brian had access to some of her digital accounts. Investigators focused less on the specific content of the forms and more on the broader questions: who initiated the applications, who stood to benefit, and how medical documentation was tailored to fit policy requirements. A review of the family's coverage revealed a red flag. Brian, the primary earner, had a relatively modest policy, while Hannah, who contributed less financially, was insured for far larger amounts. Typically, higher earners carry higher coverage. This discrepancy suggested potential financial misconduct and pointed to a clear motive. Hannah's death would have yielded substantial payouts to Brian. By trial, both sides had firm positions. The prosecution argued that Brian deliberately poisoned Hannah with lead to collect insurance benefits, supported by medical data, a detailed timeline, and extensive financial records. The defense tried to undermine the evidence, citing procedural issues. They emphasized that there was no direct proof of how the lead entered Hannah's system and urged the court to reject circumstantial evidence without definitive proof of the method of poisoning. Court proceedings began in June 2025 on an expedited schedule. The defense concentrated on the collection and storage of biological samples, noting that urine was sometimes collected in non-standard containers and handled outside proper laboratory conditions. They also emphasized two gaps: the incomplete chemical comparison between the lead found in Brian's clinic and the lead detected in Hannah's body, and the absence of the original supplement containers. The defense proposed alternative explanations, including accidental exposure. After hearing both sides, the court ruled the medical and procedural evidence admissible. It acknowledged procedural flaws that could affect how jurors weighed the evidence, but found they did not make it invalid. When witness testimony ended, the defense called no witnesses, arguing the prosecution bore the burden of proof. In closing, the prosecution presented a timeline. Brian obtained access to lead in 2021. Hannah's health declined soon after. No lead sources were found in the home. The theory of shared environmental exposure was weakened because no other household members showed contamination. The prosecution cited financial motive, insurance policies, and attempts to increase coverage, and medical analysis that refuted Brian's claim that he himself had been poisoned. The defense maintained that the evidence was circumstantial and lacked direct proof of how lead entered Hannah's system. After several hours of deliberation, the jury found Brian Mann guilty of attempted murder. The court ordered Brian held without bail, pending sentencing, and scheduled a trial for early August 2025. The judge outlined potential penalties, including life in prison, depending on the extent of harm to Hannah and the level of planning. At the August hearing, with Brian Mann already convicted of attempted murder using toxic substances, the prosecution sought the maximum sentence. They argued his actions were not a brief lapse, but a calculated, multi-stage effort over several months. During this period, he hid Hannah's worsening condition from medical providers, delayed her diagnosis, and promoted a false narrative of a shared household source. The defense asked the court to avoid a life sentence, citing Brian's clean record, community standing, medical career, prior support for his family, Hannah's survival and ongoing treatment, and lingering uncertainty about his intent. In explaining its decision, the court found that the full body of evidence, medical records, financial documents, witness testimony, and investigative findings showed a deliberate conduct. The judge described the crimes as prolonged, causing irreparable harm, with lifelong consequences for Hannah. Brian Mann was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, with no parole eligibility for the first 20 years. The court also ordered restitution for Hannah's medical costs and emotional damages, with the amount to be set in a separate civil proceeding. The sentence did not restore Hannah's former life. Although her condition stabilized, the effects of severe lead poisoning were irreversible. Doctors reported lasting neurological impairments, chronic pain, persistent fatigue, and a need for lifelong blood monitoring. Some motor function returned, but she still required a wheelchair for long distances. Hannah's son and daughter were placed in the care of her relatives. The case drew a strong public response. Former patients of Brian's clinic were shocked and confused by the verdict. Shortly after his arrest, the clinic was closed. Authorities seized all medical equipment, including the X-ray machine, for forensic analysis. Brian's medical license was revoked, and the building was later put up for sale. Insurance companies tied to the case launched internal audits of policies associated with Brian. They introduced new risk assessment measures, such as stricter verification of medical information for high-value policies. For law enforcement, the case set a precedent. Toxicological evidence can establish intent even without recovering the substance's delivery method. Investigators emphasized that indirect evidence, backed by expert analysis and consistent witness testimony, was pivotal in securing the conviction. Hannah publicly thanked the medical team, investigators, and witnesses, saying their efforts likely saved her life. She did not discuss future plans, focusing instead on healing and caring for her son and daughter.